Boa tarde. Sou Rafael Domingos, componho a equipe de coordenação do Núcleo de Educação deste museu e é com muita alegria que eu digo bem-vindas e bem-vindos ao Museu Afro Brasil. O feminismo negro é, com toda certeza, a mais potente e revolucionária das teorias e práticas de transformação da sociedade. Isso acontece por várias razões. A mais evidente delas está no fato de suas protagonistas, as mulheres negras, cis, trans, constituírem ainda, infelizmente, o grupo social mais atingido e vitimado pelos sistemas de exploração e opressão que estruturam as sociedades contemporâneas. Deveria ser uma constatação óbvia que, assim sendo, o pensamento e a luta das mulheres negras contra o sexismo, o patriarcado, o racismo e a desigualdade de classe constituam a chave para a transformação de toda a sociedade. O feminismo negro é, portanto, um movimento político que tem como objetivo a emancipação das mulheres negras. E a emancipação das mulheres negras, pelas características centrais da estrutura social que as oprime e as explora, é também a emancipação de toda a sociedade. O feminismo negro é o cerne da justiça social e da emancipação humana. É centralmente por essa razão que o Núcleo de Diversidade e Igualdade Racial da Defensoria Pública do Estado de São Paulo e o Museu Afro Brasil, duas instituições que carregam em sua gênese a história e a luta da população negra brasileira, têm a enorme honra de apresentar, nos dias que correm, a Conferência Internacional Feminismo Negro e Interseccionalidade, com a professora doutora Patricia, professora doutora Isis Conceição e professora doutora Eunice Prudente. Fazemos menção especial à professora doutora Isis Conceição, que mediou e possibilitou a construção desse evento. Tenho o prazer de convidar agora ao palco a coordenadora do Núcleo de Diversidade e Igualdade Racial da Defensoria Pública do Estado de São Paulo, que nos presenteou, juntamente com o defensor Vinícius Silva, com a proposta para a realização dessa conferência. Isadora Brandão.
Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos aqui presentes. Eu me chamo Isadora, como Rafael mencionou, atualmente coordeno o Núcleo de Defesa da Diversidade e Igualdade Racial da Defensoria Pública do Estado de São Paulo, juntamente com o colega Vinícius Silva. Vinícius, cadê você? E em nome da Defensoria Pública, gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a todas e todos aqui presentes. É extremamente prazeroso, é um momento de muita felicidade esse aqui, desse nosso encontro. Antes de iniciarmos as nossas atividades, eu gostaria, se vocês me permitirem, de propor uma dinâmica que, na verdade, é uma forma de nós nos apropriarmos desse momento, nos apropriarmos desse espaço, de nós nos olharmos, de nós nos reconhecermos, de nós nos cumprimentarmos, né? Então, eu gostaria que vocês se levantassem e abraçassem a pessoa do assento ao lado e dessem vocês também as boas-vindas. Tá bom, gente? Bom, deu uma aquecida, né? Bom, então, esse momento pertence de fato a todos e todas nós aqui. Vamos cuidar desse momento. Como eu já disse, esse é um momento de muita felicidade para a Defensoria. A Defensoria Pública, que é uma instituição prevista pela Constituição de 88, a Constituição Cidadã, uma instituição permanente e essencial ao exercício da função jurisdicional do Estado, uma instituição que é expressão e instrumento do regime democrático e que tem como atribuição prestar orientação jurídica, promover os direitos humanos, defender direitos individuais e coletivos das pessoas necessitadas em todos os graus, nos âmbitos judicial e extrajudicial, de forma integral e gratuita. Muito embora a previsão constitucional date de 1988, em São Paulo a Defensoria Pública foi criada com bastante retardo, né? A Defensoria nossa, aqui estadual, foi criada apenas em 2006, ou seja, 18 anos após a Constituição, e isso só se deu graças à intensa e ampla mobilização de mais de 400 entidades da sociedade civil, dentre elas entidades integrantes dos movimentos negro e de mulheres. A Lei Orgânica da Defensoria Pública do Estado de São Paulo, que criou essa nossa instituição aqui em âmbito estadual, instituiu como fundamento da nossa atividade a construção de uma sociedade justa, livre e igualitária, a erradicação da pobreza e redução das desigualdades sociais e regionais. Evidentemente, essa missão institucional não pode ser realizada a partir de uma defesa apenas judiciária, estritamente processual. Ela demanda que nós, defensoras e defensores, tenhamos uma série de ações como essa, né, de natureza extrajudicial, voltadas para a promoção dos direitos humanos, ações de articulação com movimentos sociais, entidades públicas, ONGs, visando a implementação e efetivação de políticas públicas para as populações mais carentes. Eu gosto de salientar que as defensorias públicas gozam, muito embora sejam instituições públicas, de autonomia administrativa, funcional e de iniciativa de sua proposta orçamentária. Essa autonomia que garante à instituição independência em relação aos demais órgãos estatais e impede ou busca evitar ou garantir, na verdade, que essa instituição esteja imune a diversas formas de interferência política que possam afastar-nos da nossa missão institucional. E como consequência dessa autonomia institucional, nós, defensores e defensoras públicas, temos por lei, gozamos por lei de independência funcional para atuarmos de acordo com a nossa consciência, com os direitos humanos e com a Constituição Federal, de modo que, como nós costumamos dizer, nós somos agentes políticos de Estado. Tudo isso para dizer que nada disso seria possível, né, se não fosse a atuação da sociedade civil. Não só a criação da Defensoria em São Paulo está totalmente vinculada a essa mobilização social, como a própria criação do Núcleo Especializado de Defesa da Diversidade e da Igualdade Racial, que é promotor desse evento em parceria com o museu, é também tributária da sociedade civil, né? Foi numa conferência realizada no ano de 2008, que contou com um protagonismo muito importante de mulheres negras, em que se aprovou, né, essa proposta de criação de um núcleo especializado para debater e promover ações em relação a essas temáticas, né? Então, as mulheres negras, mais uma vez, muito presentes na nossa história, né, institucional. Apesar de tudo isso, quando eu fui conduzida à coordenação do núcleo pelo Conselho Superior da Defensoria Pública, agora em 2018, em agosto, eu e o Vinícius, que é meu parceiro na coordenação, apenas este órgão teve, pela primeira vez em sua história, uma mulher negra à sua frente. E isso diz muito, essa retrospectiva nos diz muito, porque, embora nós, mulheres negras, estejamos na linha de frente das lutas sociais, por justiça, por garantia de direitos, contra o machismo, contra o classismo, contra o racismo, nós estamos e continuamos alijados das instâncias de poder, né, dos lugares decisórios, a partir dos quais são adotadas as políticas que impactam diretamente em nossas vidas, né? Nós que estamos, infelizmente, ainda na base da pirâmide social e que sustentamos, a partir do nosso trabalho invisibilizado, do nosso trabalho desvalorizado e das nossas redes de afeto, toda essa sociedade. Assim, eu gosto de pensar esse evento como mais uma oportunidade de nós falarmos a partir da vivência específica que este lugar estruturalmente subalternizado, que nos é imposto, nos proporciona. De nós falarmos, vejo esta como uma oportunidade de nós falarmos ao invés de sermos faladas, de nós elaborarmos coletivamente a partir das nossas experiências, né, enquanto mulheres brasileiras, latino-americanas, afro-americanas, enfim, enquanto mulheres terceiro-mundistas, né, no sentido geopolítico, né, não geográfico, e compartilharmos esse saber a respeito das nossas dinâmicas de opressão, das dinâmicas de opressão que nos afetam e das atitudes que nós podemos e devemos adotar para enfrentá-las, né, o que a nossa querida Patricia denomina de ponto de vista da mulher negra. É uma tarefa difícil, porque nós não detemos o controle dos aparatos, né, que dão suporte à ideologia hegemônica, mas é uma tarefa extremamente necessária, né? E nós, da Defensoria, esperamos muito, a partir desse espaço, contribuirmos, né, para a construção desses saberes, para a construção de um projeto emancipatório protagonizado por mulheres negras, que seja realmente capaz de descolonizar a nossa sociedade. Eu gostaria de finalizar mencionando a filósofa e ativista negra Sueli Carneiro, que vai falar dessa nossa situação de marginalidade peculiar, né, essa situação de marginalidade peculiar da mulher negra, afirmando que essa visão nossa, a partir desse lugar onde nós estamos estruturalmente situadas, é uma visão distinta das contradições nas ações e ideologia do grupo dominante. Na verdade, ela vai dizer que essa marginalidade peculiar é o que estimula um ponto de vista especial da mulher negra, permitindo uma visão distinta das contradições nas ações e ideologias do grupo dominante. A grande tarefa é potencializá-la afirmativamente através da reflexão e da ação política. Então, nós esperamos, a Defensoria, que esse realmente seja um espaço de reflexões, com certeza será, né, e que nos permita potencializar essas ferramentas de atuação política, que são tão urgentes e agora ainda mais urgentes nesse cenário que nós estamos vivendo, né? Por fim, eu queria agradecer imensamente a Escola da Defensoria Pública, que patrocinou o evento, né, junto com o Museu Afro Brasil. Gostaria de agradecer também a equipe do museu, toda a equipe envolvida na organização do evento, né, na pessoa de Emanuel Araújo, na pessoa do Rafael Silva, que foi um parceiro tão importante, né, Rafael, para a construção desse momento, a equipe do nosso núcleo, que também sempre se empenha muito para executar os nossos planos megalomaníacos, né, Vinícius, e, enfim, a todos e todas que estiveram envolvidos na organização e preparação desse momento, e, evidentemente, mais uma vez, a todas vocês. Então, que nós tenhamos um excelente encontro.
Convido agora ao palco a antropóloga e coordenadora de planejamento curatorial do Museu Afro Brasil, Ana Lúcia Lopes.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Estou aqui no nome de Emanuel Araújo, que se encontra um pouco afônico, para dar, na verdade, as boas-vindas a vocês ao Museu Afro Brasil. Dizer breves palavras, porque, na verdade, nós estamos ansiosos pela palestra, pelas conversas que nós vamos ouvir, né, por esse privilégio de receber aqui no museu esse encontro. Antes, só um pouquinho sobre o Museu Afro Brasil. O Museu Afro Brasil fará, o ano que vem, 15 anos. São 15 anos de muita luta e teimosia para manter um museu que é do Brasil, na perspectiva afro-brasileira. Esse museu, como todos devem saber, nasce a partir da coleção de Emanuel Araújo, que cedeu ao Estado de São Paulo parte dela, que Emanuel passou cerca de 40 anos colecionando, reunindo obras, documentos que mostrassem a presença com dignidade e competência da população negra na construção do nosso país, da nossa cultura. E isso é o Museu Afro Brasil. É um museu de história, memória e arte, mas é um museu de competência e dignidade. Aqui, o negro narra na primeira pessoa. Aqui, jovens e crianças se veem retratados com competência e dignidade. O horror da escravidão está registrado, mas está registrado dentro de uma instalação do navio negreiro. Você sai do navio negreiro entrando em contato com o que foi o horror da escravidão, mas você vê fora dele só a presença fundante da população negra afrodescendente, africana, no Brasil, na construção da sua cultura, da sua identidade e da sua história. Então, esse é um museu de todos nós brasileiros, mas é um museu fundamental para resgatar toda essa imagem que não é só, além de ser invisibilizada, ela é subalternizada. E nós aqui, nesse espaço de 12 mil metros quadrados, mantido a muito suor, quase sangue, mas com muitos momentos de alegria, continuamos nessa luta e nessa certeza. Não sabemos o que acontecerá conosco, mas temos um processo de 15 anos de manutenção, de um exercício com muito esforço, um exercício de manutenção desse museu para garantir que jovens, crianças, adultos se vejam refletidos na sua dignidade, na sua potência e não no lugar que a ideologia dominante quer colocar a população negra. Coloca, mas não consegue. É o museu da dignidade, mas é o museu da teimosia, da insistência. E foi assim e é assim que a população afro-brasileira se manteve e se mantém. A contribuição fundamental dos afro-brasileiros na história, na tecnologia, nas artes, se encontra presente no Museu Afro Brasil. Não só a partir do seu acervo, como das exposições temporárias, que sempre fazem um recorte desses conteúdos e conceitos. Portanto, é para o Museu Afro Brasil um momento de muito especial alegria, já dito, muito bem dito pelo Rafael, eu não preciso me alongar mais, receber as nossas ilustres convidadas, essa parceria com a Defensoria Pública, que foi uma dádiva de relação muito produtiva e muito boa de ser feita, né? Muito generosa de todas as partes, e todos vocês. Esperamos que voltem ao museu sempre, porque esse é o museu que é nosso, que é de vocês. Muito obrigada, bom trabalho para vocês.
Bem, antes de prosseguirmos, para que tenhamos todas e todos uma excelente tarde, eu tenho alguns informes. O evento ele conta com tradução simultânea do inglês para o português. Todos que estão com o aparelho já está sintonizado. Caso alguém tenha algum problema técnico com o aparelho, é para procurar a nossa equipe. Cadê a nossa equipe? Aqui do Museu Afro Brasil, que pode orientar e ajudar a solucionar esse problema. A gente conta também com interpretação em Libras ao longo de todo o evento. A conferência será transmitida, está sendo transmitida ao vivo, via fórum permanente. O registro da atividade fica permanentemente disponível. Em função disso, após as intervenções de quem participar dos debates, a gente vai encaminhar um termo de cessão de uso de imagem, para que a gente possa deixar o registro disponível. Nós estamos no Teatro Ruth de Souza, do Museu Afro Brasil, que conta com saídas de emergência nas extremidades e os toaletes ao lado direito e esquerdo do palco. Pedimos a todas e todos que deixem seus celulares no silencioso para o bom andamento da atividade e aproveitamos a oportunidade para agradecer ao SESC São Paulo que viabilizou a vinda da professora doutora Patricia ao Brasil. Agora sim, para iniciar a conferência, eu convido novamente ao palco para a mediação da mesa a Defensora Pública Isadora Brandão.
composição da nossa mesa a professora Patricia Collins.
Da Universidade de Maryland, College Park, e chefe do Departamento de Estudos Afro-Americanos na Universidade de Cincinnati e ex-presidenta do Conselho da Associação Americana de Sociologia, autora das obras Black Feminist Thought, Black Sexual Politics, African Americans, Gender and the New Racism, Intersectionality and Black Words, Black Women and the Search for Justice, entre outras. Gostaria de convidar também para a composição aqui do nosso debate a professora doutora Isis Aparecida Conceição. A professora Isis é pós-doutora em Direito do Estado pela USP, professora adjunta de Direito Internacional Público, correto? Professora da Unilab, também mestre, né, pela UCLA, membro do Comitê de Seleção do Orador da Sociedade Civil no lançamento da década dos afrodescendentes da ONU, educador em Direitos Humanos pelo Instituto Montreal, Quebec, enfim, é um currículo bastante extenso, vocês viram que eu tive dificuldade de manejar. Obrigada, professora Isis, pela sua presença. E gostaria de convidar também a professora doutora Eunice Prudente para a composição. A professora Eunice é professora de Direito da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de São Paulo, parecerista doc da FAPESP, professora titular da Universidade de São Francisco, e é importante ressaltar, é a primeira e única mulher negra professora da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de São Paulo. Sejam bem-vindas, todas vocês. Vou me juntar a vocês e aí a gente pode dar início. Vou pedir ao pessoal que está controlando aqui o data show que ponha o primeiro slide da apresentação da professora Patrícia.
I'm just going to stand up. All right, so I forgot all of my Portuguese. Olá. Oi. Obrigada. To everyone on the stage and to all of you. Thank you for coming today. This is a real honor to actually have a conversation with you. I will be doing a talk today, but I am much more interested in having a conversation with my new friends and colleagues on the stage, as well as with you. And today I will be talking about 3 ideas and revisiting 3 ideas in my own work. And they are Black feminism, intersectionality, and social justice. Now, I could come and give you a talk as if I were the expert on everything. But I think it's really important for each of us to realize that we have to always ask ourselves questions about our own work and our own practice. We have to challenge our own ideas and our own behavior. So in that spirit today, I come to you to teach, but also to learn. Many of you who are familiar with my work may be familiar with one book that I wrote called On Intellectual Activism. Now that is how I view my work. Coming up with, ooh, that was different. What's going on there? All right, should I go faster, slower? Are you all right out there? You're doing okay. All right, I'm going to get myself together up here. We're going to get this working. All right. But what I wanted to say to you is I'm in one of those moments of reflection about my own work. We, as a culture, as a globe, are in a moment of reflection around the political changes that have occurred here in Brazil and are occurring, as well as the political changes that have occurred and will occur in the United States. I've had the good fortune of coming to Brazil fairly frequently lately. And every time I come, I learn something. I see something different. I think something new. My work that I call intellectual activism has 2 dimensions. One dimension is speaking the truth to power. And that's a really scary thing to do sometimes. To take on the people who say to you, we have all the answers, respostas. We have all the questions, preguntas. And we know everything, and you know nothing. That would be the kind of knowledge that the West has created about us. And I say us by claiming myself as a Black woman, but also a much broader us that includes many other people, groups of people who are also seen as lesser and incapable of speaking for ourselves. So the work that I do, that is work of speaking the truth to power, often leaves me going to places where people like me have not been before. To be the first or the only one who shows up and everyone says, oh my gosh, a Black woman, can she think? Can she write? Can she speak? We're afraid of her. She must be stopped. And one has to be very strategic in speaking the truth to power, particularly now, because when power feels threatened, it can become very dangerous. But that doesn't mean that ideas stop. That doesn't mean that fear stops us in our tracks. It means that our arguments have to be sharper, and we have to be more strategic in how we say them and write them. Now, I say this to you because a lot of the work that I do, speaking the truth to power, is not directly aimed at students or young people. I'm talking to power because I want to get into those places, not to criticize them, but to run them myself. And I would encourage you to think about speaking the truth to power in that way. Whether the power you are speaking the truth to is an academy, a medical establishment, lawyers and You know those lawyers have lots of power. Please stop looking at them, all right? The legal profession is very, very important, but it is powerful. Whether that power is a certain church or religious domination, where the leader says, I know everything that's right, and you don't know, just follow me. We cannot be blind followers. So that's speaking the truth to power. But another aspect of my work is speaking the truth to people. Who are the people who need to hear new ideas, who need to see new images, who need to think about their lives differently? And these are often the people who are written off. We are in a wonderful museum that is full of ideas and objects for us to look at and imagine new futures for us. So a lot of what I do as well is trying to speak the truth to people, all kinds of people. I'll talk to anybody. I'll talk to a little kid in the supermarket line. I'll talk to an old person in my gym who's trying to do a push-up, and I'll cheer them on. I will talk to my white male colleagues who think they know everything and tell them, maybe not. I'll speak to young black girls who are popping gum, and I'll say, tell me about your life, my young sister. Because everybody can learn from conversations with each other. At this particular moment, I find it's important to step back and take a look at our conversations around three things, what I'm writing about now, what I've written about for quite some time. And that is the substance of my presentation today. Not just to tell you about these things, but to open the door for a conversation, perhaps, about how these ideas travel. How do they travel to Brazil? What is black feminism in Brazil? And how does that differ from black feminism in the US? And how is it the same? That's one conversation we need to have. A second conversation, for me at least, is the whole idea of intersectionality. What is that? A lot of people are claiming intersectionality now. You should hear them. I am an intersectional feminist. I am doing intersectionality in my work. I am doing intersectionality in my practice, and I know what it is because I'm a smarty pants and you don't. That kind of thing. This is a period of time where we have to look at the terms that we have created and ask ourselves what they mean, particularly if they are terms of power that people want to take away. Black feminism is a term of power. Intersectionality can be seen as a term of power. And so can my third idea, social justice. There would be no black feminism if there were not social injustices. So we have to remember that there's something bigger than ourselves. Now that is kind of a statement of philosophy to open my talk, because I decided I want to come and talk with you. I don't want to talk at you. So who are you? Are you good people? Yes? Raise your hand if you're a good person. Now look at those hands that are up. Is that true? You know that person next to you, right? Okay. Let me get started and try and behave myself. Let me move on to the first slide. And we can go all three. 2, 3. All right. I'm going to be talking about 3 sets of ideas today, things that what I'm thinking about each one of those. Some of this may be repetitive for some of you because it will be not historical, but I just need to make sure we're all in the same place. Part 1, I'll be talking about anti-black racism and US black feminism. Part 2, I'll be talking about how intersectionality matters. Let's take on what that term means and what it might mean. And in part 3, I'm going to argue back to basics, social justice revisited. And in each case, I'm going to ask you to think about the connections between what I'm saying, because I will be giving American examples. I'm talking about the US, and what are the implications of this argument for Brazil, and for Black Brazil, and for Black women in Brazil. I'm not here to speak for Black women in Brazil or for Brazil. I'm here to learn. First slide, next slide. Anti-Black racism and US Black feminism, and why I decided to frame it this way. Well, here's the question that feminists often ask. Well, how can we get more Black women into feminism? Now, the assumption is that somehow Black women aren't already feminists. If you don't call yourself a feminist, that means, well, somehow you're a feminist when you call yourself that. I'm a feminist. You know what that means, right? No. I think we really need to take a step back and ask how there might be, and I would call this an indigenous Black feminism that comes from the space of the challenges that Black women face. And I'm going to argue pretty strongly, some of you may disagree with this, and I won't be able to say a complete argument, but I will just lay it out and we can connect the dots later, that anti-Black racism, now notice the term I'm using, I may scare some of you by talking about it this way. Anti-Black racism, not just racism, which just papers over everything, but that there are varieties of racism, expressions of racism that are targeted to distinctive populations with particular histories that have consequences today. And I would argue we are in a period of time where we can see much more clearly the contours of an anti-Black racism that fundamentally devalues Black people and says that's a lesser group of people. Now, it would be very nice if in the history of African American women, the group I will be talking about, I am talking about now, it would be very nice if throughout US history, African American women could have said, well, I don't feel like being Black today. I'm just going to go into the feminist movement and be white. Or I'm just going to go into the feminist movement and I'm going to have no gender whatsoever, or no race whatsoever. Or I'm going to go into the socialist movement and I'll have no race and no gender. This would have been lovely if we were all individuals that way. But if you're dealing with a form of oppression that is a group-based form of oppression, and that's what I would argue anti-Black racism is, it will have particular challenges that shape your entire life. So let me start off by talking about that. I will argue that Black feminism emerges in the context of grappling with the questions and the issues that confront the lived experiences of Black women, African American women. It does not originate in ideology. It does not originate elsewhere. It's problem solving. Problem solving the questions of how one stays alive. We'll move to the next slide. The signature event for African Americans was captivity, the process of enslavement. That's one form of captivity. And slavery was quite significant in the US, and it took particular forms in the US. Very significantly, slavery explicitly tried to eradicate all aspects of African culture. Slavery was a process of controlling people by saying, you have no political rights, you are chattel, you're not even people, you're like animals. By saying, because we own you, the work that you do for us benefits us. And anything that's left over, you can have the scraps. That's called economic exploitation under a capitalist system. But what was very significant in the US as well is the creation of a new world Black population that was honed in this situation of captivity. When I say that, a new population, we must realize that there were no black people historically. This notion of using the term black people is directly tied to racism. Racism created black people. Before that, there were Africans from various backgrounds, there were Yoruba, there were Igbo, there were a variety of people who would be considered of African descent. But this notion of how you actually form a black collective identity in captivity is the existential question confronting African Americans. Now you may think, well, slavery was over in 1865, which is a long time ago, but captivity never ended. Political domination, which you here call colonization, the process of keeping one group subordinated in the US through color-conscious racism, we see color everywhere, regulating color everywhere, didn't end. We had various forms of captivity, and that is very significant to keep in mind. The problem of mass incarceration, that is a contemporary issue in the US, where institutions lock up many youth, is not a new issue. It's an old issue that takes new form. So if you would like to see something like captivity as having an expression under slavery, or having an expression under Jim Crow segregation, or having a certain form of expression in cities through ghettoization and the creation of neighborhoods that you starve of services, or now mass incarceration, the whole question of what does it mean to be free when you are in a context of captivity? That's a very different question than what does it mean to be something else, a cheerleader. It's not an identity question, it's a political question that's both individual and collective. So anyhow, captivity. As individuals, Africans confronted the ongoing existential dilemma of a future without a collective past. Now that's a really important thing to remember about African Americans. To have to create a collective black community stitched together in a context where people devalue you. Anti-black racism, I would argue, is the denial of freedom. And as a collectivity, black people constructed an identity from these various elements that I have here. But I'm not going to spend time on that. Let's move to the next slide. Because what I want to argue is that why black feminism? Well, black feminism didn't emerge because a few black women were sitting around the kitchen table one day and said, these men better shape up. We don't like the way these men talk to us. Gee, that would be nice. If it were just a question of handling black men, that's easy, all right? This is something else that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the gendered contours of anti-black racism. And what this means is that black men and black women, those who were categorized that way and have been for quite some time, experienced a gender-specific form of this racism. Black women in particular experienced assaults on their bodies that were quite significant in terms of the integrity of black women's bodies. Sexual assault, having babies you don't want, not getting to keep your children is very significant in this feminism, in black feminism. It really means something very different when one looks at this particular set of experiences. So anti-black racism takes gender-specific forms. Women and men who experience anti-black racism confront the same, there's a verb missing, confront the same existential questions of captivity, violence, and death, but they confront them through distinctive forms. this is kind of a serious talk, isn't it? Let me just keep moving. So I don't want to depress all of you, but this is to give you the context within which I see Black feminism emerging. So when I say the threat of death, let me just say that really quickly, because I want you to be convinced of how serious I am about this material. One way that power operates is to threaten to kill you. And if it doesn't kill you, it makes you witness the death of people you love. Whether that is your child in the street who was shot by someone else, or whether that is your own mother who's killed by your own father. Right? What happens here is the threat of death and violence. We can look at these ideas of violence as just the individual aberration of the person. But the culture itself creates a climate of violence that is part of anti-Black racism. So I look to the structures and ask, how are people behaving in relation to those particular structures? So, resisting anti-Black racism that's going to affect men and women differently will take gender-specific forms. Early on, Black women realized that it wasn't just a generic Black person who was experiencing anti-Black racism. And many Black men also realized that. It wasn't like this was a new idea. The issue is what to call it, what to do with it. So for me, this is the origins of Black feminism, and why it persists is because anti-Black racism persists. When that goes away, Black feminism can say, you know, we can have a party, we can celebrate how gorgeous we look, we can do all that stuff, we can go shopping. We're not at that point yet. We're not even close to being at that point. So I see this particular project as existing into the future and taking different forms depending on what we do now. All right? Now everybody take a breath, because I have to pick up the pace of this talk, or we will be here until tomorrow. All right? All right, everybody, take a breath. All right, cool off a little bit. Okay, let me move on. All right, so move on to the next slide. So we move on now to what I want to take you through very quickly. These are the main ideas. Yep, we can put all three of them up. Black feminism and Black freedom struggle. I'm going to argue, my premise is that Black feminism emerged in the context of a Black freedom struggle. I had to tell you about captivity first, before you relate to Now I want you to notice when that noise happened. The minute I started talking about freedom. Did you hear that? Because I gave a talk once when I got to the exact same part and all the electricity went out. We were in darkness. And I said, that must have been a powerful idea. So when you have an argument about what it means for individuals and a group of people to resist their oppression, now they begin to label in the terms that reflect their experience, not somebody else's experience, but their own experiences. That can be incredibly threatening. And that is the way that I use the term freedom struggle. And what a freedom struggle would look like. Freedom is an aspirational concept. It's a big idea. It's something you strive for. Because there have been multiple times when freedom has been granted legally, when you realize we're still not free. What will it take for Black people to be free is the question. And I'm arguing here today that Black feminism has a particular take on that question. First of all, social justice constitutes the ethical core of Black feminism and of Black freedom struggle. We have to remember that Black feminism is not sort of an offshoot or runaway or renegade dimension. Black feminists aren't crazy people who sort of left Black people behind. Rather, this particular project is committed to social justice. Social justice for Black people and for Black women. And that's a shared feature. But I think there are two distinctive features of Black feminism that come from Black feminism and what it means. One is the whole idea of intersectionality. And this is the idea, at its most basic, where Black women said, well, maybe a racial analysis is good, but we need to talk about gender as well. Race and gender intersect in shaping my experiences with anti-Black racism and with other things, whatever women are involved in. Now that becomes the analytical framework for Black feminism and for problem solving, intersectionality. And keep in mind the social problems that are confronting Black women are fairly substantial. But this is a very powerful framework for thinking about how to solve those social problems. When you say we can have more tailored solutions to our problems if we take gender into account, we can have better strategies. The third idea that I'll say a few words about today is the notion of flexible solidarity as a framework for political action. Now, most people think about solidarity as there's one boss, and the boss says, agree with me. We're all in solidarity, and we submit. Whether that big boss is a race-only framework, I'm the big boss man of race. All you women, just be quiet. When we as a people are free, then we'll get around to your issues, women. Your issues are secondary. That's a race analysis. Or the big boss man may be a gender person. And that's usually a white woman who says, it's all gender. I don't even know why you're bothering with race. No, it's all gender. Or it could be a class person. I don't know. But what Black women realized was, along with this intersectional analysis, that solidarity wasn't just submission. So being in solidarity with someone did not mean agreeing with the ideology. And that's how you belong. Well, I'm a feminist because I agree with feminist ideology. And then we go down the list of what those things are. No, it was more a question of how do you work every day with people when you like some of what they do and you dislike some of what they do? How can you be flexible in your solidarity with folk without being flighty or just irresponsible? What this meant in the context of Black history and in the context of Black feminism, because the U.S. is so segregated, meant how do Black men and Black women work together in confronting an anti-Black racism? And Black women realized that there was a gendered analysis there, but had to be flexible and strategic about keeping that private in terms of their relationships with Black men, and when a Black feminism could be a public entity in its own right without being accused of weakening the Black community. It's an interesting argument. So let me just move on and talk about a few examples, because I think that always helps people. So let's move to the next slide. I like to start with Ida Wells Barnett. And let's keep going, just put everything up there. If you know anything about Ida Wells Barnett, I would encourage you to Google her. Now, Ida Wells Barnett is not really known for being a feminist, because when we think about Black feminism, we're looking for people who are always self-identifying as a Black feminist. But this is a new identity for many people. Ida Wells Barnett, to me, could be categorized as embracing Black feminism based on what she did and what she knew, what she argued, her ideas and her activism, her intellectual activism. First of all, Ida Wells Barnett was an anti-lynching activist. She worked during a period of time after the Civil War. She was born a slave, right? She was a free child, but she was born into slavery. She worked as an anti-lynching activist during a period of time when African Americans had rights. And because African Americans had rights, they were threatening to the existing systems of power. So what you began to see during that period was lynchings. I mean, I don't mean just random mob lynchings. I mean publishing in the newspaper that there will be a lynching of a Negro on Saturday and bring your picnic lunch and your babies to enjoy the entertainment. Did everybody hear that? Everybody seems to think lynching was like, all of a sudden, white people lost their minds and ran around and lynched people. No, it wasn't that irrational. It certainly was impassioned. Lots of passion. But she saw in her own life friends of hers, neighbors of hers who were lynched. And she said, that's it for me. I have to do something. Now, I don't know if you've encountered an event in your life that said to you, I have to make a lifelong commitment to something. And in the case of Ida Wells Barnett, she made the commitment to anti-violence work, anti-lynching work, and she also made the commitment to social justice. Her autobiography is called Passion for Justice, I believe. But anyhow, what you see are these core themes that I've been talking about for Black feminism. Social injustice. She was against that social injustice. She could not look away. Intersectional analysis. Ida Wells Barnett put forth a very provocative thesis that lynchings were not because Black men lusted after white women. That was the prevailing dominant discourse, the discourse of power at the time. Oh, these Black men can't control themselves. They are prone to violence. We must control them, or all life as we knew it will be completely gone. She put forth the thesis that, no, perhaps it's not that at all. Perhaps we also have a sexual argument about white men who are raping Black women as well. Perhaps there's an argument about sexuality there that is masking or speaking to this state-sanctioned violence. So she defended Black masculinity and said a lot of these lynchings are not about sexuality at all. They're about something else. And she also looked at sexuality around Black women being vulnerable in ways that are different than Black men to the violence that they both encountered. Now, for these arguments, she was really threatened quite a bit and had to leave the South, could not live there. She was a journalist, for those of you who are confronting that type of scary situation, if you work as one, but that's what he did. She was a journalist. But this flexible solidarity issue is most significant. Because Ida Wells Barnett was an irritant in the side of everybody. She was an irritant to the Black men who were founding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Male-only thing, and she said, no, this has to be done differently. She was a thorn in their side. She was a thorn in the side of women suffragettes trying to get the vote for women. Ida Wells Barnett said, I'm a woman. I want to vote too. I want to be in that march that you're having in Washington for suffrage. And white feminists said to her, well, do you think you could stand to the side, Ida? Because we're afraid if they see you in there, we won't get the vote. We'll be less effective getting the vote for white women. Remember I talked earlier about the boss lady, phenomenon. So Ida Wells Barnett thought, well, she crashed the march. She refused to be in a segregated section of the march. She was really an irritant. Now, when I look at her work, she's often not claimed as being a Black feminist, encouraging us to look beyond the categories that we have encountered or we have inherited. But if I look at what she stood for, she's clearly, not stood for what she did, she's clearly a forerunner of contemporary Black feminism. Let's skip the next slide and go to the one after. This is what I'm skipping, if you want to know. Ella Baker, 40s and 50s. Let's go to the next slide, contemporary. The Black Lives Matter movement may seem very far removed from Ida Wells Barnett, but it's not in a lot of ways. By the way, that fan is wonderful. Whoever just turned that on, thank you very much. All right. It's pretty hot up here, people. You know this? Are you hot out there? Okay, no, you're not hot. You can come up here and fan me a little bit. All right. Anyhow, the Black Lives Matter movement, have to wait for the translation, okay. The Black Lives Matter movement really is about very much the same themes that began earlier and are illustrated in the work of Ida Wells Barnett. The whole notion of social justice and participatory democracy, this is a social justice movement. It may appear to be a movement against state-sanctioned violence against Black people, and it is that. That's the particulars of the movement. But it is very much a social justice movement. But what you see in Black Lives Matter, I'm skipping over quite a bit of time here, is a deepening intersectional analysis. Whereas Ida Wells Barnett was confined to talking about race and gender, a deepening intersectional analysis of unequal citizenship, of the inequalities of citizenship, now can talk about race and class and sexuality. You all right over there? That is some serious signing you're doing. All right. Can now talk about race and class and sexuality and nation in ways that are much more expansive. So that early Black community that I talked about in terms of a new world collective Blackness under captivity now has to expand using the tools of intersectionality to encompass all forms of Blackness. This is what they're arguing. They're saying you can't have a Black community and leave Black people behind. You cannot leave Black queer people behind. You cannot leave Black transgendered people behind. You cannot leave Black sex workers behind. You cannot leave the people who are considered to be troubling to the view of Blackness that we want to put forward. You cannot leave those people behind. This is a deepening intersectional analysis that is used as a corrective for thinking about one's own self and one's own political praxis. Now, the term intersectionality only came along fairly recently, but the idea, as I'm presenting to you today, is much older. And the third category of flexible solidarity is really very interesting in terms of how they work. They say, we think it's very important that there are discussions among Black people where we're going to have to use this flexible solidarity to get used to listening to and learning from people who typically are not seen as being authorities about their own lives. It's not a question of just the educated people know everything. Of course, get an education. But do they know everything? I don't think so. So that tool of working with and against people, this flexible solidarity, a way of building solidarity from the bottom up, is essential for a social movement of this kind. But they also say, but we are interested in having alliances with other movements that have had similar experiences and that take a similar view around social justice. It's not that other movements have to have the same experiences with violence as the Black Lives Matter movement, but it has to be a space, there has to be a space for conversation. So really we have a contemporary, continuing deepening, I would argue, of these three core ideas of social justice, of intersectionality, as flexible solidarity, that do not come from the ideology of the West, but that come from solving the specific problems that Black women are confronted with, and analyzing the society in which we live, the things we will see because we are Black women. All right, now that's a really quick and different approach to Black feminism. Because usually Black feminism is approached as feminism only with an adjective, all right? It's feminism, and then you add an adjective. You add the Black, you add indigenous, you add something, as if feminism pre-existed the Black part. And I have flipped the script as it were, and made an argument that is rooted in the actual material conditions that Black women have been in the U.S. for quite some time. Now, are you still here? I didn't realize I was going to be so serious today. Okay, but I'm sort of feeling like this is serious material, and these are serious times. Let's move on to part 2. Let's get the next slide. Move on to part 2, which will be faster than part 1, by the way. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how intersectionality matters. So I'm going to pull that theme from the talk and just say a few things about it and hope we can come back to it in conversation a bit. But anyhow, how intersectionality matters. I'd like to just say here how I see intersectionality. Intersectionality is a form of critical inquiry and praxis. It's not just ideas. It's not just political activism, it's both. It's a set of ideas that we now have that are named in 1990 that draw upon this earlier history. And I've just recounted one history within African American women's history, but I think that there are multiple stories to be told. But intersectionality is critical in the sense of being criticizing of society that's there, but also critical as being important to people who need new ways of analyzing the societies that they're in. So it's not just one or not just the other, and my concern right now is that in the academy, in the US, we have basically a hijacking of the term and a recasting of the term, so it means something else. Now, you do see how I see intersectionality is deeply embedded in oppression as a tool for seeking about and challenging oppression. When that term travels, it can go elsewhere and be a tool for anything and be very far away from politics. And I think that's a challenge for today. But anyhow, next slide. A turning point for intersectionality. I bring to you a problem. I think we're at a very interesting turning point around the set of ideas that are associated with Black feminism, which many people find to be very threatening, but also to similar projects that are raising similar concerns. And intersectionality is a really interesting way of tracing that turning point. So in some ways, this is an intellectual turning point that we have to ask, is intersectionality being depoliticized? Are its teeth being taken out of it? Is it being turned into something nicer than it was before? Intersectionality in the US is increasingly depicted as something called a narrow identity politics that creates social divisions. Now here's how this argument goes. All Black women want to do is talk about themselves. They don't care about anything more than that. They just care about their identity. Reducing politics just to identity, well, identity is clearly important to politics, but reducing it to an individualized, inward-looking, narcissistic identity politics, and then saying, the people who do intersectionality can't think about anything beyond racial analysis, or beyond gender analysis, or beyond sexual identity, or beyond any of that. Which is why I spend so much time now saying, this is about social justice. This is a social justice idea. This isn't just some random, I woke up one day and I discovered I was Black kind of thing, or I happen to be Black. That's the expression I like in the US. Have you heard this? I'm a person who happens to be Black. And I always wondered, when did you happen to not be Black? You know, how does that work? Okay? I'm a human who happens to be a woman. Almost like it's an accident that politics. Because what I've been talking about today is identity that's rooted in history, that manifests itself now, and that will persist into the future, that is individual and collective, right? So we can talk more about that a little later on. But the whole notion of all of a sudden intersectionality became popular a couple of years ago. Now, 10 years in the 90s, intersectionality, we're just laboring away in the wilderness. You know, we're doing our little intersectionality stuff. Okay, let's do some more. Let's do some more intersectionality. And then it got popular. So now you have all kinds of people walking around saying, I'm an expert on intersectionality. And because I'm an expert, I'm going to tell you it has no future. Or it's not good for anything. Or it's the solution to everything. You have a lot of very interesting conversations once intersectionality became popular. But you do know that when you are popular, that doesn't mean you are substantive. You do know that public recognition is not the same thing as exercising power. So intersectionality is a pretty face right now for a lot of people, because when we look at the media, it consumes new ideas, and then it throws them away when they're no longer popular, right? This is not a popularity contest. This is really a set of ideas where we're trying to figure out what to do with them. Because what I would argue is that intersectionality offers a language for working with existing social divisions. Now here's what the mainstream folk often say. They say, we were in solidarity before intersectionality. And when you came in and introduced all that race and gender and stuff like that, you shattered the country. This is a fascinating thing to be told, all right? To be told that you created racism, how did that happen, all right? Or you created sexism, that makes no sense. So this is a really interesting time when intersectionality is being blamed for the very social divisions that have been created elsewhere. It is often the solution to trying to solve those particular issues. So intersectionality's metaphor, how am I doing here? 20. I'm sorry, people. You're going to have to suffer a bit longer. Are you all right out there? I'm not used to having this much time. This is what it's like luxurious. It's like a bowl of ice cream. You know, you thought it melted, it all went away, and then somebody brought you another bowl. Okay, all right. So I can now talk a tad more slowly and not skip as much. But basically what I would say here is to think about intersectionality as its metaphor. It's a crossroads. It's where ideas meet that historically have been separate. It's another way of coming at intersectionality. Right? I've given you one pathway into it through Black women, but now let me just talk about the big idea for a minute. One of my trips here, a colleague of mine said to me, she said, you know, intersectionality is kind of like corner culture, where people in a city get together on the corners and they hang out and they talk with one another. They come from their various streets and they spend time in that meeting place, and then they go home, kind of thing, and tell those at home what they talked about on the corner. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I hadn't really thought about it that way, even though I grew up in a city that had a lot of corner culture in terms of who was actually hanging out on the corner. There was some iffy people down there, but the corner itself was a meeting place. Intersectionality in some ways is a crossroads, not something you pass through, not one of these amazing intersections that are in some of the big cities, but a place where you go into it, you linger, you share, you think, you argue, and then you go back and think about who you were before you entered that intersection and how you were changed as a result of that journey. So for example, the race scholars, now we'll talk about scholarship for a minute. The race scholars were very comfortable talking about race without gender. They thought, the kind of field that I've been in, African American studies, They felt that all you needed to do was talk about black men, and you could leave patriarchal ideas untouched. But when they were dragged kicking and screaming into the intersection of race and gender by Ida Wells Barnett then, and certain people now, they began to develop a more nuanced argument about racism that talked about race and gender, and more nuanced analyses of what needed to happen that reflected that intersectionality. And that is the kind of thing that can happen in that intersection. We've seen a lot go on with feminism in the U.S. as a result of this. It's not a mystery that feminism in the past in the U.S. has been very white. But the thing to keep in mind is U.S. society has been profoundly segregated. People think there's far more integration in the U.S. than there actually is. We've been lulled into that because we've had Barack Obama. All these people could relate to Barack Obama. I like Barack. I would play basketball with Barack. I like Michelle, POTUS, FLOTUS. I mean, we have nicknames for our president, all right? That kind of thing, without noticing that you can have proximity. People can be next to each other, but there can be tremendous social distance. So of course we've seen each other, but we've never met in the crossroads to have the type of analysis and politics that was needed. So intersectionality, it's not the solution to these problems, but it provides a framework for all of the individual projects, many of them post-World War II, some predating, like U.S. Black feminism, some very new, to meet in the crossroads and say, if I think questions like this, if I think about violence through an intersectional lens, how would I think about it differently? What does violence mean? Is violence just ideas? Hate speech? Is violence individual violence? The kind of violence that might occur in family or among two people who love one another and one beats the other one up? Is violence a state entity in terms of military policy? What we quickly find is that race and class and gender and sexuality and nation and ethnicity and age, those categories are connected with different forms of violence. And when we meet in the crossroads to problem solve violence, we quickly realize we can't know everything. We have to collaborate. We have to talk to one another. We have to rely on, and when I say talk to one another, face to face, yes, but we have to rely on each other's knowledge and each other's wisdom. I have to trust what the Latino scholars and the Latina scholars in the US say about the forms of racism and sexism that they have encountered. I can't say, well, that's not what we encountered, so I'm not interested in listening to you. So we're at the moment now, both in the US and globally, where there is the potential for conversations in the meeting place. But we don't have any rules about how to do it, nor do we have any rules about how to analyze all of this. And these are the questions of now that we will need to answer to move forward. So if we rely on, for example, a version of solidarity that says, will you be the leader and I'll just follow you? Well, sometimes that's a good idea. But what if you're the leader all the time, from one generation to the next, and you're wrong? Is that a good idea? So this notion of intersectionality and a metaphor of crossroads or a meeting place embodies these processes that we're living through now of desegregation in the US and decolonization globally. Here, I don't have to say colonialism didn't end with formal emancipation or freedom or the establishment of a constitution. I understand you've had many constitutions here. But The whole notion of decolonization is an ongoing process of encountering ideas and practices and people who are different than you, and learning and putting together alliances, flexibly or not. So anyhow, next slide. So let me go quickly now and talk about just a few ideas. First, for those of you who would like a very precise and concise slide about intersectionality, I decided to bring it because I thought you might be interested in this. I've just finished a book about all of this, and I'm writing another one that I'm almost finished. So I often forget that the way that I approach things may not be as clear as I would like them to be, because I leave out a lot. So for this particular slide, let me just say really quickly, and I've already said this, summing up, intersectionality is a form of critical inquiry and praxis. And I have a few bullet points there that you might want to think about. It investigates how race, class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, religion, and citizenship constitute intersecting systems of power. Power is central to intersectionality, that mutually construct one another. So that's a theoretical claim. That doesn't mean you can see this all the time in every situation, but it's a theoretical premise that should guide you through every situation that you're in. And when you think you totally understand it, you probably left something out. There's always more to be learned. You can ask me about that later. I'd be happy to talk about that. It examines how social inequalities are organized, endure, change, and resisted. So social inequalities are central to this particular set of ideas. Racial inequality, gender inequality, all of that. It's not just about, in my mind, any old thing. It's something that's devoted to analyzing the inequalities around us that can help us. And another dimension that I've mentioned repeatedly, but now I'll just put here in the bullet, is it articulates with broader political and intellectual struggles for social justice. There's more than just black women, there's more than black feminism. There are many, many struggles for social justice. And we will have a better understanding of what social justice is if we can learn more about those other struggles. But here's a caution for intersectionality. So let me move to the next slide. And I'm going to introduce a word called saliency. The saliency of oppressions. Just because race and class and gender and sexuality and age, all of those things are there theoretically, that does not mean they are all equivalent in how they are organizing what's going on. In theory, race, class, gender, and these other categories are all theoretically compelling to shape what we look at. But in practice, some systems of power are more salient than others. They are more prominent, they are more pressing, they are more visible in certain historical periods. The entire first section of my talk was to give you a sense of U.S. Black feminism as a social justice project where race was initially the salient category, the front stage category that nobody could ignore, but for Black women, where gender was also developed in that same context. So that race-gender intersection was fundamental, but not the end of the story. The deepening of intersectional analysis within U.S. Black feminism has been an expansion of the categories from the early days of slavery through actions like those of Ida Wells Barnett, through the Black Lives Matter movement. So the question here is to not assume, this is a criticism of intersectionality. I tried to use it in my dissertation, but it was too hard. I just couldn't get all those categories in. Therefore, it's a flawed theory. I'm arguing something very different here. You can have very different kinds of intersections. You can have a cultural and a class intersection, and really ask how those two things intersect in shaping what it is you're looking at. So this is for us to broaden, use this broader theoretical framework to then look at, in particular historic settings or among particular groups, what have been the salient intersections and how have they changed over time. And the third point here is, and the next slide, has to do with flexible solidarity. Now, I'm just going to tell you, I'm getting a little tired. Are you getting tired too? We are almost through this cover. You're not getting tired. You want me to keep going? Because this flexible solidarity is difficult. This is a hard idea. And I don't know, how smart are you? Are you smart people? Let me see, let me look at this side. Is anybody sleeping over here yet? Could you check your neighbor? Do I have to make you get up and hug each other again? I'll do it. I have no pride. Now that I know it's okay to do that. Because what I am presenting to you is a complicated argument. I decided I'm not going to just make, this is not going to be a feel-good rally. All right, we can do that. But this is really the time for serious analysis, so we have some tools to think about the situations that we are now in. And some new tools, some different tools. This notion of flexible solidarity, I think, is really important. Because now I would put all of this together. I would put the histories together. There's this term called relational difference. We're related, but we're different. Usually when people think about difference, they think about, you're different than me, you're not the same as me. Different than me, you're not the same as me. It's always about me and not me. That's the whole other, is me and the other. I'm talking about something else here. I'm talking about a way of thinking about relationships among groups, particularly political groups, that are cognizant of what they share and the ways they are different. Where one looks at the relationship, that's the thing to look at. How do we build a relationship among these entities? Recognizing that relationships change and grow. Have any of you ever had a love relationship as an adult? Not with your mama, I'm not talking about that. Not that she will always love you. That's not really what I'm talking about. Did you have a partner who you just knew you were going to be in love with for your entire life? You know that? We were going to be together forever. Maybe you were about 14 years old when you had that relationship, right? And then by the time you got to be 16, he or she, whatever the combinations you want to go for, was changed a little bit. And then over time, by the time you got older, you realized a relationship is not forever. It is perpetually changing. So the nature of the connections that one has will change. And they change because you have to work at the relationship. Now I'd like you to take that idea and think about that perhaps generally. The ways in which race and gender combine now are different than the way they did before because that relationship has changed over time. We can say the same thing about groups. Groups can be in short-term coalitions, and you say, yeah, we can work on this project together. That's one kind of coalition. It's a win-win coalition to each of us. But I think we're facing something that's much more significant now, where the relational differences that have divided groups, for example, in the US Black women, Latinos, Latinas, Asian Americans, indigenous folk, have been treated as separate histories. We approach those histories as, that's your history, and our history is over here, as opposed to saying, our histories are interrelated and intertwined. How is it now, for example, that what is happening to Muslim communities in the US is related to what has happened to Black communities historically, or Latino communities historically? What are the connections among those stories that we need to investigate that become the basis of solidarity? Not a fixed solidarity, but a flexible one that lasts over time and that changes at the same time. So anyhow, relational differences of intertwined and interdependent histories that underpin social inequality, we need to do a better job of that. Not everything is going through the center. A second theme here is that relational thinking neither erases nor prioritizes particular histories. And I look at this in terms of US Black women. It doesn't privilege Black women, but it doesn't erase Black women, but rather puts them in dialogue with other similar histories. So that's where I think we need to go with these projects, and flexible solidarity is a way of working with this kind of fluidity. Really saying we're going to be in solidarity, right? So now, let me move on and finish. Let me just go back to this last slide and wrap this up. So where are we? This is the last slide coming up. Here it is, all right, the summing up slide. So basically, we can put everything up. What you see there are the three ideas that I talked about today. And the question that I would like to leave you with is really, I would be interested in knowing how you think about Brazil in relation to what I presented today. Because now we're in a period of time where, for a while, globalization was taken for granted. It was almost like that was the global frame. But now we're in a period of time where nationalism is much more evident and obvious. The significance of nation states in shaping the histories of groups. Notice when I talked about US Black women, I didn't talk much about national policy and the Americanness of this story. But the Americanness of the story that I shared with you is quite important around American national identity and around American national policy. We are seeing nationalism now because there are groups that are called ultra nationalists. They want to claim the nation state for themselves and to remake it in their own image. So I would raise the question of the similarities in Brazil and in the US around the trajectory of US Black feminism. That's important. Around the potential intersections that you see in Brazil and that you see in the US that are different. The saliency issue that I talked about earlier. For example, I think that class is much more salient in Brazil. I also think the national story has been more salient in tamping down issues of recognizing race and race-gender intersections. But this third notion of social justice, and is social justice up to the task of grounding the kind of work that we have to do today? Is this a big enough idea still? Is it going to lose today? When we're looking at a globe that is increasingly fragmented, doesn't think of itself as global necessarily, that's the pressure to encourage us not to think about these relational differences, but to go back to the old framework of oppositional differences. My nation is better than your nation. As opposed to what are the connections between what is going on here and what is going on there. So I think these are old questions that confront us in new ways today. And I don't have answers for these. But I do know that a conversation between this audience and the kinds of audiences that are in the US whether we're talking about Black women in Brazil or Black women in the US, whether we're talking more broadly in terms of groups here or in the US, and beyond, are the kinds of conversations that are needed. Not of turning inward, back into our categories of comfort. That argument about identity politics is just all about you. But also a groundedness in the discourse and the politics that we have developed that becomes what we take into that metaphoric crossroads of intersectionality. And we're flexible about who we find there and how we deal with one another. We're not always right about everything all the time. So this particular talk comes to you at a moment when I'm rethinking all of this. Because I think every so often it's important to just throw it all up in the air, see where it lands, and put it back together again if you can. So I would like to thank you for your patience, organizada, for your patience, because this was a very long talk, and I did not expect to stand and talk for this long. In fact, I didn't expect to stand at all, but I was afraid if I sat down, I might go to sleep on myself, which is always an incredibly embarrassing thing to happen if you are, in fact, the public speaker, right? So I am now going to sit down, and hopefully my two esteemed colleagues will help us. So could we finish this talk with something? Could you just stand up and give each other a hug again? Get up. You need to stretch. Just get up. Hug a different person. I mean it.
Bom, eu gostaria de agradecer infinitamente a professora Patricia pela presença, por ter aceitado o nosso convite, por nos brindar com essa posição. Bom, professora Patrícia, nós gostaríamos mais uma vez de agradecê-la imensamente pela presença, pelo aceite, pela disponibilidade para estar com a gente, fazendo essa conversa sobre questões tão importantes, por nos brindar com uma exposição que traz ferramentas teóricas, instrumentais, para a luta protagonizada pelas mulheres negras em nosso país, particularmente no momento em que as conjunturas políticas dos Estados Unidos e do Brasil parecem se aproximar. Entendo que esse é um momento muito oportuno para essa troca. Bom, então eu vou passar de pronto a palavra para a professora doutora Eunice Prudente, agradecendo mais uma vez o aceite pelo convite. Professora, fique à vontade.
Emocionada, quero agradecer então a oportunidade de conhecer pessoalmente a doutora Collins, porque o seu pensamento é muito importante, já conhecido aqui no nosso grupo universitário, ou principalmente entre as feministas, e eu tive a felicidade de conhecer, então, pessoalmente. Então, eu quero agradecer também a professora doutora Isis Conceição, pela aproximação aqui na organização do evento, a doutora Isadora, todos que colaboraram para este evento. Então, vejam, é muito rica, naturalmente, a fala, as contribuições da professora Collins. Ela se refere ao norte da América e observe que é justamente onde ocorreu a revolução contra o colonialismo. O racismo que 11% ou os negros norte-americanos enfrentam é uma situação diferente dos 51% da população brasileira ou desta América Latina que não conheceu a Revolução de Ideias. Aquela Revolução de Ideias, a Revolução Protestante que firmou o direito de liberdade de expressão, não chegou aqui. Também não conhecemos as revoluções liberais que eles promoveram a segunda e conhecem lá no norte da América. Nós também não conhecemos. O que temos aqui ainda é formas de um poder. Assim, formas de, são ainda expressões do poder do catolicismo lá dos séculos, dos tribunais de Inquisição ainda. Nós precisamos revolucionar a forma do pensamento para podermos enfrentar uma parede. Esta parede é esse patriarcalismo que é masculino, branco, endinheirado, heterossexual, como se apresenta. Então, nós temos aqui, professora Collins, professora Isis, empresários amigos da Defensoria, uma parede a ser enfrentada. Também usamos muito o termo escravo. Acho que o mais correto é escravizados, porque essa escravização quase adentrou ao século XX, o histórico aí que todos conhecemos, e observe que esta escravização submeteu todos os negros, todos os africanos, todos nós, afrodescendentes brasileiros, descendemos desses escravizados. Por que escravizados? Primeiro, pela própria natureza humana. Ninguém aceita ser submetido, aceita uma reação. É violenta, são práticas, como bem explicou aqui a professora Collins, são práticas violentas. Então, não são escravos, escravizados. Então, também há essa realidade que deve ser ponderada no momento de nós analisarmos a interseccionalidade entre as questões de gênero, as questões de etnia, e como enfrentar a discriminação racial aqui entre nós. Eu estou saltando aqui alguns quadros devido ao fator tempo também. Então, a percepção de diferenças, que é algo muito natural, que sobretudo as escolas de direito deveriam questionar, pesquisar, estudar, só recentemente, já sob a égide desta Constituição, que é inclusiva, a atual de 1988, observamos um interesse no curso de direito. As diferenças, porque não há pessoas idênticas, somos iguais para direitos e obrigações, mas temos diferenças biológicas, sexuais, étnicas, culturais, que exigem respeitabilidade e aceitação. Então, ainda estamos construindo essa sociedade livre, solidária, como está na Constituição. Por outro lado, temos a questão da desigualdade racial, professora Collins, com um número significativo de famílias, e na sua grande maioria negras, no estado de miserabilidade, em uma república que é rica, mas profundamente injusta na concentração de rendas, né? Essa é uma das nossas situações para podermos analisar também a questão, né, de gênero e etnia. Também lembraria os senhores que o governo brasileiro, infelizmente, recusa-se, não aceita que se desenvolva entre nós uma política pública de gênero. Pois é, a homens, a mulheres, a pessoas trans, é uma situação. A questão da orientação sexual, uma outra situação. Essa questão não está devidamente clara entre nós e abertamente analisada, aceita, necessita sim de uma política pública de gênero que o governo, né, está aí se recusando, como todos estão acompanhando esse momento grave, como já foi delineado. Então, também faz falta para as nossas discussões a política pública de gênero. Quem dispõe de política pública é o executivo, né, o poder público. Também, senhores, lembraria a nossa grande conquista, que é esta Constituição de 1988, que vai tomar os direitos humanos tão romanceados como direitos fundamentais. Isso é sério, é técnico, porque se são fundamentais, são indisponíveis, invioláveis, a despeito das violações assistidas, interdependentes e complementares, eles são indivisíveis. O ser humano deve ser visto como ele é, né, por completo, ele é concreto, ele tem necessidades para ser e para sobreviver. Então, há direitos individuais, as liberdades tradicionais, mas há os direitos sociais, há os direitos coletivos, há a necessidade de um meio ambiente equilibrado e acompanhe a política atual do nosso governo a respeito do meio ambiente, né? Não é o momento de analisar isso, mas faz parte aqui. Então, nós temos já uma Constituição e observem que ela é conquistada a partir de uma ação firme e conjunta dos movimentos sociais. É muito importante que esses 51% da população brasileira, que são os negros, tenham sempre a consciência de que a nossa cidadania, o exercício dos nossos direitos, advém de ações políticas dos movimentos negros. Não foi do pensamento, não foi das academias, foi luta mesmo, né? E os movimentos sociais, unidos contra essa ditadura militar, que durou aí quase 2 décadas, né? Foi que construíram esta Constituição atual, que é inclusiva. E aí, né, temos também que pensar um pouco como é essa interseccionalidade aqui entre nós, né? Então vejam, a violência na escravização durante 400 anos, são os primeiros séculos dessa república, banalizou entre nós, brasileiros, mas ao que parece aí por toda a América Latina, a questão, né, as ações de violência. Há sim de se fazer um estudo sobre esse entrelaçamento de questões étnicas de gênero, porque são 400 anos de escravização, como muito bem já foi analisado aqui hoje. É a anulação do outro, é retirar do outro, coibir o direito de ser pessoa, ser humano. muito diferente daquele instituto da escravidão, do mundo antigo, do direito romano. Não. Esta ocorrência desses séculos onde o sistema socioeconômico capitalista mercantil chegou à industrialização, dependeu, sem dúvida alguma, do sangue negro, né, e desta escravização aqui nas Américas. Também, para chegar aqui à questão do nosso feminismo, observem a coibição legal, está no nosso direito, da formação do núcleo social básico, a família, para esses negros, para esses escravizados, para esses afrodescendentes. Na atualidade, o nosso direito civil, com base principalmente na Constituição Inclusiva, dispõe, professora Clóvis, de famílias, mas isso não ocorria antes. A única família que o direito brasileiro conhecia era a casamentária. E esta família, esse núcleo social básico, foi coibido a muitos brasileiros, ou seja, durante esse século de escravização. Isso traz consequências e me faz pensar se o Brasil teve uma elite. Ninguém pensou nisso antes, que isso não ia dar certo. É um pensamento. E depois, observando também a escravizada, a mulher negra. Ela também era um objeto sexual dos senhores, né? É aí já também muito conhecida, já analisada esta situação. Mas nós temos aqui no Brasil uma outra questão muito grave, que foi a utilização das escravizadas no meretrício pelas famílias proprietárias. Não era ação do crime organizado, era algo também banalizado, considerado natural nas grandes cidades brasileiras, né? Então nós temos aí o nosso primeiro Código Criminal brasileiro em 1830, século XIX, mas ele não criminaliza o lenocínio, ele não criminaliza o rufianismo. Por quê? Porque esta era uma prática das famílias, com aspas, proprietárias das escravizadas. Isso traz também consequências. Uma outra questão gravíssima nessa escravização era como eram tratadas as crianças, né? Então, as crianças escravizadas eram brinquedo das crianças das famílias proprietárias. E todos nós que somos pais, mães, sabemos como as crianças tratam os seus brinquedos. E quando a gente diz para o pediatra, mas chegou o brinquedo novo, lindo, desejado, ele decompõe, né? Destrói. Não, diz o pediatra, né? Não, mas isso é próprio, é o desenvolvimento das crianças. É assim que elas tratam os seus brinquedos. Ora, quem tratou durante séculos um outro ser humano como brinquedo, com que caráter ficou? A banalização da violência nesse Brasil grande. Nos vitima, com certeza, não é? Porque a comunidade negra brasileira ficou prejudicada, mas o caráter de quem tratou o outro como brinquedo também ficou prejudicado. Daí a conclusão, né, que há uma banalização da violência entre nós. Professora Clóvis, um sinal na história do Brasil que uma vila está tornando-se uma cidade é a existência do pelourinho. É um tronco na principal praça da cidade, onde acusados eram amarrados, açoitados ou sofriam a pena de morte. Quem era este acusado que hoje é o suspeito? Os negros, né? Então, quando a gente pensa, estuda as cidades, o sinal como começa é uma igrejinha e um pelourinho, mas nesse sentido sempre, né? Também podemos lembrar aqui rapidamente as práticas abortivas. O Estado brasileiro nunca se interessou pelo assunto ou ouviu as mulheres, apenas criminalizou. Então nós temos no Brasil hoje práticas abortivas violentas, porque as mulheres brasileiras não têm acesso à informação. O Estado brasileiro apenas criminalizou. Então agora buscamos construir uma outra convivência. Obviamente ninguém é a favor do aborto, mas, né, nós temos situações aí peculiares e cabe à sociedade politicamente organizada, ao Estado, assumir e cuidar do assunto, e é preciso ouvir as mulheres. Se quer, né, este direito nós, brasileiras, alcançamos. Então, vou tirando aqui já algumas consequências, né? A banalização da violência, a inexistência de uma elite com uma visão econômica, porque só se enxerga a propriedade minha hoje, né? Então nós temos, né, aí, com aspas, como dizem os analistas, os donos do poder. A banalização da tortura, né? Aí também é uma realidade entre nós, o desrespeito ao trabalhador doméstico, que na sua maioria ainda no Brasil são mulheres, e são as mulheres negras. Por quê? É o after day, falando um pouco de inglês aqui, o after day, no 13 de maio, a mulher negra sequer percebe que agora é uma mulher livre, ela será a empregada doméstica das famílias que lhe escravizavam. Esse trabalhador doméstico, essa trabalhadora doméstica, somente conquista os direitos sociais, com 100 anos depois de 1888, com o advento da Constituição de 1988, e ainda há correções a fazer, FGTS, né, etc. Também uma prática bastante presente entre nós de discriminação racial com a invisibilidade do negro. Difícil até, agora não, já conseguimos a criminalização da discriminação racial, mas e a invisibilidade? Então, passamos por instituições e ambientes onde os 51% da população não estão presentes. Algo invisível, principalmente a mulher negra, né? A nossa formação histórica, cultural, não tem contribuído para a igualdade. Depois deixo os quadros aí para quem quiser conhecer melhor, vou passar para assuntos finais aqui. Sob a égide dessa Constituição de 1988, com protagonismos singulares, como foi o caso da doutora Maria da Penha, né, que sendo ofendida, violentada pelo próprio marido, né, que tentou matá-la 2 vezes, ela consegue, através da Corte Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, que finalmente o Judiciário brasileiro analise o seu processo. O marido foi preso, mas entre as recomendações que aquela corte mandou ao governo brasileiro, veio a recomendação de que, pelo número grave, gritante de mulheres violentadas no âmbito da sua própria família e no âmbito doméstico, se criasse legislação própria específica. E aí nós temos, então, a chamada Lei Maria da Penha. Então, há conquistas, nós temos luzes aí no horizonte, mas é verdade que ainda não conseguimos, né, o avanço, a sociedade livre, justa e solidária, como está aí na nossa Constituição, mas temos também o aperfeiçoamento da Lei de Diretrizes e Base da Educação, com a Lei 10.639, que determina o estudo, o conhecimento da Mãe África. Vejam aí, acabamos de visitar o Museu Afro Brasil. Imagine a importância de uma instituição como esta para a implementação da Lei de Diretrizes e Base da Educação, que foi aperfeiçoada quando se introduz, quando se determina que as escolas estudem história da África, cultura afro-brasileira, e observem a cara, professora Collins, numa sociedade que 51% é negra, né? Então, ainda estamos nessa luta. Mas quero também, falando aqui, né, dos direitos da mulher, lembrar aos senhores o Estatuto da Igualdade Racial. O Estatuto da Igualdade Racial, que traz, né, as questões da igualdade envolvendo os direitos fundamentais da população negra. E quando se refere à moradia, a saúde especifica a mulher negra. Então, a invisibilidade está sendo diluída, mas ainda não chegamos lá. Então, estamos convivendo sob uma Constituição igualitária, sim, mas ela precisa ser implementada. E há leis que estão previstas na Constituição e que ainda não existem. Por exemplo, temos o artigo 243, depois visitem a nossa Constituição, se referindo que os latifúndios, ou seja, os proprietários de áreas agrárias, rurais, que escravizem pessoas e que também cometam outros crimes, como, por exemplo, cultivar plantas psicotrópicas e tal, mas principalmente essa questão da escravização de pessoas que, né, conceder ou submeter seus trabalhadores a trabalho análogo a escravo. É uma escravização dos nossos dias. A principal pena seria a perda da terra, que para o latifúndio, né, é tudo que nós queremos, e queremos que eles sejam extintos mesmo. Mas ocorre que o senador Romero Jucá, que não ganhou as eleições, o mandato vai terminar em dezembro, mas o senador por Roraima, Romero Jucá, tomou todas, né, os projetos de lei que vai regulamentar o artigo 243, levou para o seu ambiente, para o seu gabinete, etc., mil pistas. Então, suponho ou desejamos que em 2019, o novo Senado, o novo Legislativo brasileiro, regulamente o artigo 243 da Constituição Federal, para que advenha, então, a lei, trazendo a penalidade que acho que finalmente enfrentará a escravização no Brasil no século XXI, que é a perda da terra. E, para finalizar, quando houve a Guerra de Secessão nos Estados Unidos, quando se conquistou lá o fim da escravização, famílias, principalmente sulinas, vieram para o Brasil. Nós temos até em São Paulo uma cidade que se chama Americana. A família ali, a família da Rita Lee, excluída a Rita Lee, mas a família que veio eram dessas escravizadoras, lá nos Estados Unidos. Esta é uma realidade histórica que os brasileiros conhecem. Mas o que me surpreendeu e eu não tinha conhecimento, e um orientando que chegou dos Estados Unidos contou foi que essas famílias, após o fim da escravização e que perderam a guerra de secessão, famílias sulinas, são hoje as proprietárias das prisões privadas nos Estados Unidos e que fazem o aprisionamento um negócio. Talvez por isso os Estados Unidos da América tenha um número também de encarcerados e de encarcerados negros que foi um negócio, que após não poder mais escravizar de uma forma, o negro escolheram outra. Mas falei dos Estados Unidos e o Brasil criou o crime de vadiagem. Falei do Código Penal de 1830, mas depois veio de 1840 e aparece esse crime de vadiagem. Quem é um vadio? Seria uma pessoa que não teria meios de sobreviver e que não trabalha. Sendo que a discriminação no mercado de trabalho é, depois dessa tal invisibilidade, né, uma forma cruel de discriminação numa república capitalista. Ou se detém os meios de produção, né, tal, ou as pessoas vão oferecer à sociedade a sua inteligência, a sua força, os seus conhecimentos para sobreviver. Coibir essas pessoas de trabalhar, discriminar, é muito grave. E isso advém. Então, aqui no Brasil, também é o quarto país do mundo que mais escraviza pessoas. Mas, professora Gomes, se nós trouxermos para essa discussão a idade da população carcerária, o Brasil talvez ultrapasse os Estados Unidos e fique em primeiro lugar. Porque também aqui é muito grave como se criminaliza questões sociais e como se prende, né, se aprisiona os jovens negros. Então, né, temos aí quase que uma continuidade também aqui entre nós da escravização, porque hoje a vadiagem não é crime, né? A vadiagem hoje é... Cadê os juristas aí? Os advogados. A vadiagem não é crime, mas é contravenção penal. Mas é contravenção penal, é delito. E quem é o suspeito? Quem é que é aprisionado? E quem muitas vezes mesmo, vai para a prisão? É o jovem negro. Então, lá como cá, né, a escravização continua de outras formas, porque essa questão de latifúndios todos sabem como é. Com aspas, o coiote vai a regiões muito pobres, rurais do Brasil, e o Brasil é grande, né? Nós sabemos disso. Vai pegar lá e arregimenta trabalhadores que são levados para outras regiões muito mais longe do que aquela, e lá eles são escravizados. Nós temos jovens brasileiros que já foram escravizados 3 vezes. Então, toda a juventude dele, ele foi escravizado. Por quem? Quem é o culpado? Pois são os donos, os grandes proprietários de terras e tal, e, né, a devida regulamentação do artigo da Constituição que poderia alcançar essa situação tão grave. Ele existe ainda. Então, senhores, eu vou terminando aqui dizendo, então, de uma ação política de descolonização que ainda nós brasileiros não conhecemos e não tivemos. Talvez aí, através agora de muitos estudos e de ação política conjunta, consigamos, né, vencer esta situação. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada, professora Eunice, pela sua valiosa contribuição.
Bom, muitíssimo obrigada, professora Eunice, pela sua valiosa contribuição. Eu vou passar, sem mais delongas, a palavra para a professora doutora Isis, que também vai comentar um pouco a respeito da conferência da professora Patrícia. Daí eu sugiro que, na sequência, a professora Patricia faça um retorno em relação aos comentários das duas debatedoras. E aí, de imediato, a gente passa para que vocês, né, também possam fazer intervenções e colocar dúvidas. Eu vou, já na sequência, daqui a alguns minutos, assim que a professora concluir, a gente vai informar como é que será a dinâmica para a formulação de perguntas. Tá joia?
Obrigada, Isadora. Boa tarde. Os colegas falam que quando eu converso parece que eu estou chorando. Lamento, é a vida, cada um com as suas. E também temos nessos, né? Mas, primeiro eu quero agradecer o convite, né? A Isadora, a gente ficou pensando essa conferência juntas, mas a minha participação não era uma premissa, né, da proposta da conferência. E, enfim, eu tive a aula agora e adorei, até que foi bom, mas agora eu fico nervosa para falar, né, que é o ponto. Agradecer a professora Eunice por sempre me acompanhar, agora minha supervisora no pós-doc, né, no Largo São Francisco. E have no words to thank you, Professor Patricia Collins, because I am a global Martin Global Faculty Fellow from Connecticut, and usually I'm trying to reach information from abroad in this debate, but you brought so many things new and updated, and that my mind is still, I am still with more questions than the questions that I thought you that I had previously. So I'm going to try to bring some of my questions and then bring the new questions that I reached after your presentation. At first, I want to mention, stress the information that you brought about, let me see the concept here, is intersection, sharpness, salience, the concept that in situations of intersectionality you have salience of some categories related with another. Why that? I want to stress this. Because the situation that led me to research on intersectionality during my postdoc research, supervised by Professor Eunice, is a situation that I experienced here in Brazil during Barack Obama conference. It was 1 year and a half ago. He was talking about the fact that a country cannot be developing and claim to be a democratic country if it does not include women. And once he started to say that, people started to clap, and they even interrupted the previous president, like, oh yes, for sure, no machismo, no sexism at all. But he continued his line of thought, and he said, we cannot discriminate a person because of the color of this person's skin. And once he said that, in a sequence, after being interrupted with the standing ovation, everybody was silent, like in a museum or something like that. And then I talked with Professor Prudential that I think that the salience here in Brazil still has to do with race. That's the thing that people here don't want to talk about. And people are very comfortable to talk about feminism, but they bring intersectionality on the terms of feminists that they want to talk about. That's it. So that's what leads me to leave behind critical race studies, because my master at UCLA with Professor Crenshaw was in CRS only. And then I said, Professor Prudente, I need to understand more this dynamic of gender and race, because here in Brazil people are really open to talk about gender violence, but they don't see that Black women are women. And once you put the race aspect, the conversation is done. That is the first thing that I would like you to bring as interacting with this concept of sapiens that you brought. It was really interesting. And the question from 2015 in Brasilia that I told you back there, how are you understanding the difference and similarities among the concepts of intersectionality, multiple jeopardy, and matrix of oppression? You say that you have developed a new way of understand these categories and the interaction among these categories. I think it would be cool. I have taken notes. Oh yeah, now I'm going to the question. It was introduction, sorry. Here in Brazil, we have a small group of people that bring the fact that the decolonial theory that is very in trend in Brazil was theorized by 3 white men in North countries, in countries of the North global dynamics. And even though they are Latinos in the United States, here in Latin America, they are not excluded, they are privileged. And that's a tricky situation, because some people use this tool of decoloniality to criticize the concept of Black feminism, affirming that Black feminism comes from the global North, and therefore it has some aspect of imperialism, and the decolonial approach would be an answer to that. But you have a concept of outsider within that I think that is the answer already to that interpretation. The idea that the people who has a colonial past inside U.S. community, I mean, they also have interest in the colonial approach. They are the one making the debates about intersectionality and other concepts that you work as a matrix of oppression and multiple jeopardy. Let me see, the second question was, it's just second and third. I won't go to the order. I said to a friend of mine, I don't want to take all the time to monopolize the professor. I will try to make the questions after the conference, because I think that the audience has more right to make few questions now than I do have, but let's try. The second question, please, or the third. Let me see what is the best. One thing is that you are very committed in making this distinction about knowledge production and the challenges that Black women face inside the academic space to produce knowledge that is useful for us and turn this knowledge into tools that can make available a better activism and a better public policy frame. And I want to ask you how it was your experience as an outsider within a university. I think that Black professors still are not a large number in the United States. In Brazil, law school, I have already told you that Professor Alice is the first the only. And no, I hope not. We are working in that direction. But it's not going to be here because I live in Salvador. It has a huge beach area, beautiful seashore. I'm living in front of the seashore. I don't want to leave Salvador anymore. I mean, no questions, come back. And, oh, I had a chance to get to know your book in 2009, after I got my master here in Brazil, my master degree. And I noticed that your book was released in the United States in the 90s. So you can see that it took almost 2 decades for the book to reach me. And I have reached the book in Montreal because I had my master, I got a fellowship to study human rights in Montreal. And I was in a bookstore in Montreal and I saw your book and I said, yeah, the one that you signed, the Black Feminist Thought. It was there because it took a long time to be here in Brazil in English, and we still do not have in Portuguese. Oh, it's coming, great. Okay, that's a thing that a colleague was mentioning about the fact that we do not have this material in Portuguese, and mostly of the people who reach them, the knowledge production on intersectionality, black feminism, etc., they rarely, not ordinarily, but mostly of the time, they are not in a position, in a standpoint position of fully understand the debate of race when they are doing the translation, because to have knowledge of English and be a black woman in Brazil is a demand of too much information. I work in a university where 50% of the seats are reserved for African students. So I have the black Brazilians, the African women, and a lot of identity. But with all of them, the challenge is to bring the decolonial, the post-colonial, the feminism, and the black feminists from the United States, because you have several identities, but this debate is not being brought to Brazil. And when reach Brazil, this debate reached the country with what Kimberly has said, gentrification. The person who brings the concept makes it more pleasantable for the person, and therefore we do not reach the full content. I think those are some of the questions that I saved on my cell phone. I don't want to be a monopolizer, but those are my questions.
Ok. Obrigada, Isis, professora Isis, muito obrigada pela sua contribuição. Vou então devolver a palavra à professora Patrícia e vou pedir que as pessoas que quiserem, a gente vai fazer a princípio um bloco inicial com três perguntas, tá? Para 3 intervenções. A gente está com um tempo bastante apertado, né? Então eu vou pedir que as pessoas que tenham a intenção de se manifestar, posso te indicar como referência, Rafa? Pode ser? Se inscrevam com o Rafael, tá? E ele vai organizar esse momento posterior. Professora Patrícia, fique à vontade.
Thank you. I'd like to comment, first of all, on your question about decolonial theory and how to position this work in relationship to the North and the South. I have always thought about, I don't think colonialism is necessarily, a colonial relationship is necessarily geographic, the way we're making it, all right? So I have always looked at African Americans in the U.S. as basically the South within the North. And that to me is a way of looking at, and I think that's is a good case to be made for that for African Americans in the U.S., but also with a degree of migration that we have in the world now, it's harder and harder to make this argument that there's sort of these crisp, clean borders between the North, which is the place of power historically over the South, and the South itself, if we want to use that particular vocabulary. And I think beginning to make the argument of what does it mean to have the South within the North begins to connect African Americans, groups that are oppressed in the North, like indigenous groups would be a really good example of this, with indigenous groups globally or black groups globally, to begin to see that the orientation of these arguments that we're making isn't necessarily just the nation state that we're in, all right, but that the orientation can also be similar projects that one finds in other locations. Some of them in countries of the South, and some of them in European countries. For example, there's a very lively and difficult discussion going on in Europe about blackness in Europe, right? That parallels the kind of anti-black racism argument that I brought here today. There's a new institute in Sweden. Now, one would think that Sweden is a country that has no black people, hasn't had any black people. Why is this going on there? But they are finding the same kind of anti-black indicators, because these ideas don't travel just in the bodies of black people. They travel in the culture, in the political relationships. So I think that there's a lot to be said for using, and it's really interesting that you made the point about the concept of the outsider within. The notion that if you were perpetually seen as the outsider within a unit where other people belong, and if that is a nation state, that creates a certain category of reality. And in many ways, what I talked about today, I think does reflect that. But I hadn't really considered how that might map onto contemporary geopolitics. So that strikes me as really very useful. I'm thanking you for that. Right. The other question had to do, or comment had to do with knowledge production in the academy. And you asked me about what it was like for me. Well, it was hard. I don't know how to say it any other way. I was the first one integrated a lot of these. I was Unisi. Unisi, am I saying this correctly? Unisi? Am I close enough? You're the first, probably the only, and you should not be the last professor, all right? But there have been a lot of situations like that for me from the time I was a child. And you learn to see yourself as a warrior. You can either decide you're going to lose yourself in an institution that was not set up for you and doesn't welcome you necessarily, or you can think about all the people you're bringing with you. So I think about physical geographic space in a certain way. I know what neighborhood I grew up in, that kind of thing. But I also think about place as something we carry with us all the time. So I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I carry Philadelphia with me. And I think of Philadelphia differently when I'm in different settings, all right? I become a different Philadelphia native in those settings, especially when I'm back in Philadelphia. So those of us who do intellectual work, I think we have to consider that when we're in schools that were not set up for us, number one, we belong, right? We are entitled to be there. We have done the work. We are qualified. That's not the issue. And once you leave that, then you can see the other issues more clearly that are the structural issues about how knowledge is rationed and how it spreads. So you comment about getting information, sort of the discourses that occur in North American universities around decolonial theory, post-colonial theory, feminism, black feminism, and how if that knowledge is rationed, so it cannot arrive here because it's in English or it's in French or it's in another language or German, something like that, how that's kind of a slow process of how those ideas travel. One thing that I've learned, well, that can be academic time, can be very slow. But on the other hand, I just think there's a lot of gatekeeping that continues to go on around how ideas travel. So who says the three guys who wrote about colonialism, we all have to cite those same three guys? Why don't we write our own books and cite each other? So that is fundamentally what I did in Black Feminist Thought. Using the politics of citation to say, why do I have to prove myself? Like, I know this stuff. I don't have to, who am I proving this to? I'm not proving it to myself that I'm capable of doing this. So I'm going to cite as many Black women as I can possibly find who are authorities on their own experiences and those of others. And I received a fair amount of pushback from, in this particular case, white feminists that said, you didn't cite the people I read, therefore you must not have, you're not well read. And I had to say, oh no, I know exactly who you're talking about. This one and this one and this one and this one. I chose not to cite them so I could create space to cite other people. That was a hard argument for people to hear, particularly at that time. But the whole notion of how the ideas will travel, and one thing that I'm very much involved in, because I've been so welcomed in Brazil, is to try and get as much of my work translated as possible, right? And I'm working on that pretty aggressively. If you don't ask for something, people don't think to do it, all right? If you don't ask for something, the answer will always be no, because you didn't ask for it. And if you ask, the answer still may be no, but at least people are thinking. So for instance, I've been asking all of my publishers, who I've been meeting with, and I have 10 books. I've written a lot of books, all right? So I have 10 books out with different publishers, not all different. 2 books with one publisher, one with one, 2, 3 with another, that kind of thing. And each time I meet with them, I say, what are the possibilities of getting my work translated into Portuguese? And I ask specifically about Portuguese, because my work has been slow to be translated, because I haven't asked for it. So for example, Black Feminist Thought is translated into French. It's just been translated into French in the past 2 years. And Black Feminist Thought is translated into Korean, because someone who studied in the United States went back to Korea and said, this book needs to be in Korean. It makes no sense for this particular book to be in Korean before it's in Portuguese. And when I look at it, I thought to myself, this makes no sense. So the notion of translation and getting things into Portuguese is very significant. This is one example of this. But there are other languages where that is the barrier. And many of us who are bilingual, I'm not bilingual, I'm trying to be because I'm trying to learn Portuguese. But those people who are bilingual really need to think seriously about becoming translators and interpreters, and recognizing that space of translation as an incredibly important kind of intellectual work for the world that we live in now. Right? I think, I look at it as translating academic language into everyday speech, and everyday speech back into academic language. That is a translation function. That's how I look at it. But I think the notion of going across these linguistic borders is a very important set of ideas. And then you raise an important point as well in relationship to this, and that is the notion of translation into Portuguese, and the difficulties in Brazil of feminism travels comfortably, but race is a difficult concept because it strikes me that it is, well, it's so differently organized here. Well, it's not differently organized. There's just resistance to recognizing race as being an important concept. All right, people would be much happier if race went away, if it were just, we could go back to being we're all Brazilians or we're all whatever the category would be. But it's a very difficult category to do that with. So when you say that the people who do the translation, you can have something translated, but if you have difficult ideas, they may not travel with the complexity that they might. So for me, I like to show up and say what I think and what I believe and present my arguments and my evidence, so that my voice is also there as people are reading something that I've actually written. So you can hear me in my work. But I think that is, these are big issues, but anyway. So those are your three things. Can I ask Professor Luis a question? Can I ask you a question? I wanted to know about the Constitution, because you talk about the Constitution quite a bit. And I was interested in I looked it up before I came today on Wikipedia. And it seems that Brazil has had many constitutions, because people have said to me, the U.S. is an old democracy, and I decided that that's probably because the Constitution has been there for a while, the same one, and has been altered by amendments. But it hasn't been a question of writing an entirely new Constitution, right? So it sounds like the 1988 is a new Constitution. And I was wondering whether, the one thing my mind was, South Africa also wrote a new Constitution in the 90s, at the end of apartheid. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the constitutions that come after such periods of, I'm going to say oppression, apartheid, and a dictatorship. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but I'm saying that to have a new constitution that is capturing the aspirations of the people. If you had any thoughts about that, and also the vulnerability of these particular constitutions. Do you think this is a strong constitution that will last?
Todos nós, né, estamos aí, tudo o que nós brasileiros queremos é que essa Constituição dure, porque é a nossa 8ª Constituição, porque aquela emenda constitucional de 1969, o Museu Afro Brasil analisa como a 7ª Constituição brasileira, depois verifiquem lá o nosso próprio histórico constitucional. Mas enfim, estamos nessa 8ª, e ela, pela primeira vez, na Constituinte, o povo participou de forma organizada, através de uma representatividade via os movimentos sociais. Os movimentos sociais, o movimento negro, o movimento feminista, o movimento LGBT, os movimentos dos trabalhadores uniram-se contra a ditadura. Promoveram documentos comuns, em comum, panfletos, promoveram ações públicas nas ruas das cidades brasileiras contra a ditadura. Essa ação conjunta concluiu a sociedade civil brasileira da atualidade. Ela é forte, ela é crítica. Também recebemos, aí como todo mundo, os avanços da tecnologia, estão as redes também, com muita rapidez, promovendo comunicações. Mas é verdade que ainda somos vitimados por uma representação política muito falha. Então, nem todos os artigos da Constituição foram devidamente regulamentados. Por exemplo, temos a previsão do imposto sobre as grandes fortunas, está previsto na Constituição. Me referi à criminalização da escravização ou de submeter o trabalhador a trabalho análogo a escravo. É claro que é crime, está na Constituição, mas precisa de lei. Ainda não vencemos. Mas temos vitórias. Por exemplo, o professor Guilherme Lucci, da PUC, da área do direito, criminalista, quem estuda direito penal já deve ter consultado as obras dele. Ele vem há décadas construindo no nosso judiciário, na doutrina, mas também no nosso judiciário, injúria racial social, porque também, como é do conhecimento de todos, foi uma conquista da Constituição de 88 que a discriminação racial fosse considerado crime inafiançável e imprescritível. A Constituição de 88, em 89 já temos a Lei 7.616, que também já foi aperfeiçoada, etc. Mas surgiu essa novidade, a injúria racial, porque a pena a ser imposta é diferente, é bem inferior à do crime de racismo. Então precisou uma construção via jurisprudencial, e o professor Guilherme Lute, da PUC, aqui de São Paulo, é pioneiro e tal. Então, já os advogados, ou os tutores de direitos humanos, já levaram aos tribunais esta contribuição do professor Lute. Então, quando ocorre a injúria racial, e ela vem ocorrendo principalmente em ambientes públicos, é analisado como crime racial, como uma injúria social, é uma injúria racial, mas social, então um crime racial, aplicando-se a Lei 7.616. Então, essa foi uma contribuição do Lute, precisamos ouvi-lo mais até a respeito do assunto, mas observe a construção da nossa cidadania enquanto cidadãos negros. Não tem sido fácil, porque nem sempre o Ministério Público e o Judiciário têm devidamente reconhecido situações manifestas de discriminação racial como crime. Manda para arquivo, etc. Também temos esta triste experiência. Então, temos uma Constituição inclusiva avançada sim, mas ainda estamos numa luta para implementá-la, para que ela venha à prática, via a regulamentação, através de leis e tal.
Bom, então, quem tiver perguntas, quem quiser fazer intervenções, você dirige ao Rafael e ele vai ceder o microfone para que vocês façam as perguntas, tá?
Gente, na verdade, devido ao horário, a gente vai fazer um bloco de 4 questões, as 4 primeiras pessoas que se inscreveram, e depois a gente tem que encerrar o evento por conta da segurança do acervo. Tem os orientadores que saem, terminando o turno deles, a gente vai ter que encerrar. Mas para 4 questões, tudo bem? A primeira coisa para a Cleusa.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say thank you, Professor Collins, for sharing your knowledge with us here. That was marvelous knowledge for us to guide us in many situations. So I have 2 questions, but if it's possible, you can answer them. So the first one is about the intersectionality. I understood that the intersectionality is based especially in the exchange of ideas, of arguments, of experience, and after that, one self-evaluation about where I concentrate in that point, where I'm going to be in that context. So my question is, analyze about this point, is possible or should have intersectionality between political parties? For example, like in the US, that you have the Democrats and the Republicans for the other side. So it's possible to have the intersectionality between them to defend the black people point. That's one question. I'm going for the second one. The second one is, as you know, we are living now here in Brazil, the governments that government that have the very similarities, okay, procedures. So my question is, as you are 2 years ahead of us here, what you advise us to do in terms of the defense of feminism, of black feminism, and in terms of to continue the structure of our points here? What you advise us to do that has been done in the US by that time when the government changed, and also that should be done that were not done there on that time? What do you advise us to proceed?
I think two things are important here. The first is that 2 years is not a long time. Right? That's the first thing. Because the kinds of challenges that are in the U.S. didn't just come about when in one election. The person who is in the people who hold office now are basically the face of something that's much bigger, that's been there all along. And what we're coming to in the U.S. now is a realization that the democracy that we took for granted and the rights that we took for granted somehow can be under attack virtually overnight in ways that no one saw coming or didn't see coming. I would argue that we had to exhaust, when it comes to race, for example, we had to exhaust the philosophy of colorblindness. Martin Luther King's dream that it was possible to develop a colorblind society without thinking about color itself or without thinking about race itself. That somehow once you had an ideal of equality, that you simply could say, well, I'm no longer a racist individual, therefore we're living in the colorblind future. The media is quite significant in helping us see that future as an ideal, but not saying, here's the reality of where we are now. And the Obama administration came about at the end of a huge political struggle. It really did seem to be the culmination of the success of electoral politics to actually put an African-American person in office in the White House. This was unprecedented. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime, and that's how a lot of people felt. But at the same time, it basically took away but it sort of minimized protest in terms of energy among the young in particular, who were not as suspicious of the relations in the U.S. as perhaps others were. It took away the energy to continue to work against racism and sexism and those kinds of things. The assumption was that somehow everything was all right because we had arrived. Now this election came as a huge surprise because up through the election, the predictions were, into the night of the election, the predictions were that Hillary Clinton would win and that it would now be the year of women and gender would follow race, and all of this kind of talk that just assumed it was going to be easy. And there was very little mental and emotional preparation for the fact that you could lose. And then to get up the next morning and see and ask, why did that happen? So I think there's a fair amount of diagnosis going on right now about what exactly happened that is bigger than just the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. That's the face of it. I see what's going on in the United States as more competing views of citizenship and American democracy. On one side are people who want it to be inclusive, who want it to represent all kinds of people, who want that democracy to be a democracy, and who are building that from the bottom up, the ground up. And on the other side, we have people who have an exclusive view of American national identity that excludes most people. They want permanent hierarchy. They want to reinstall those who used to be privileged, who are still privileged, and to not have to deal with those kinds of issues. So the whole notion of what the lessons are, and sort of what has happened in those last 2 years, well, one thing that was extremely encouraging is all kinds of people became motivated. The kids say they got woke, right? That's how the young people in the U.S. talk about this. Became motivated and just saw there's a problem. And it wasn't just individuals who became motivated to run for office. You see that a lot in terms of this election we just had, because we do have elections and have protections, all right? Which is why I was asking this question about the Constitution. What is constitutionally mandated? And where are we with that? So people got involved and ran for office. A lot of women were elected this midterm election, people of color, indigenous folk ran for, one of the first times. So a lot has happened that's good. But what stands out for me in terms of what I've been talking about today in intersectionality is there's a long list of people who historically have been excluded or who've had second-class citizenship within American democracy, all right? That the notion you can have citizenship and be everybody's equal by law, but in practice, everyone is not equal. So I've been talking about black people, but we can make similar arguments about Latinas, indigenous people, Latinos. We can make a similar argument about Muslim populations who have really been targeted in the U.S. We can make a similar argument about immigrant populations, many of whom are in blended families. There's where some people in the family will be legal and some are not legal in the country. So a whole list of groups, poor white people, poor white people unfortunately have been believed. Some of the basically fake news, that's the fake news right there. But they believed it, but there are other poor people who are realizing, poor white people, who are realizing that the kind of social problems that they face aren't black people's fault. It's really clear. We have a serious drug problem in the US, right? This goes across classes, heroin, the whole thing. So the notion of the growing recognition that these separate experiences with inequality or second-class citizenship, in fact, are intertwined and interlinked. That's really what I was talking about in this presentation. There's a growing recognition of that. And I think that's really important. Now, we may not see the results of that in the next election in 2 years or 2 years down the road because of the nature of how the process has been compromised by the party that's in power now. But if we look over time and ask ourselves, what are the signs of where this might go? I would call your attention to the March for Our Lives that was held in March 2018. That was organized by youth after a school shooting. We have mass shootings. This is another form of violence in the US, gun violence and just in public, not just in black neighborhoods or anything like that. But these mass shootings that don't seem to make any sense to people, where high school kids who are going to school in a very peaceful, upscale, rich, beautiful community in Florida had a gunman come into their school and murder, I think it was something like 26 people, just going to school. So for young people, the realization that violence is not something that is just, that gun violence in particular, is not something that is just confined to a certain population or to a certain ethnic group or to black people, was a wake-up call. Now, what was interesting about their response was they said, we're not interested in any more prayers and thoughts after this. We really think we need to do something about gun violence. And they began to see their gun violence as connected to the experiences of other young people who were also experiencing gun violence. So that particular march was multi-ethnic, multicultural, young people coming together, kids who were really dealing with police violence, street violence in urban cities, young men who are basically killed by the police, that kind of thing. That kind of violence was also part of this notion of kids saying, we have to have a march for our lives because we don't know whether we're going to grow up, right? Now, I think that's a really powerful thing for young people to do. These were high school students. In a lot of ways, it resembled your Occupy movement here in terms of schools. When young people in high schools and at certain colleges said, we demand an education. Whether you win or lose is not the issue. It's always better to win. But the point is to see those particular initiatives as the kinds of issues that bring people together who have different histories, who don't particularly care about whether the Democrats or the Republicans solve the problem. They care about the social issues themselves and are looking for analyses and ways to work together to actually address those issues. So on the one hand, one could say that our election 2 years ago was just the beginning of the end. You could certainly sort of paint that story in terms of America, but you could also look at it as a turning point. I like to refer to this as an end point of something, or a turning point in American democracy that moves us in a new direction. And I honestly do not know, but I do think that we have to think about what kinds of arguments we're going to have for that, and what kind of political strategies need to be built for that. So what I've just told you are arguments and political strategies. You know, I'm going to be not so much the optimist, but I'm trying to read the actual situation without just standing one step back from it and say, what is useful for us to think about at this particular time? So the question of gun violence is certainly something that a lot of youth care about. But drug addiction is really important. It really is, and it's not receiving. More people die every day in the US from that than from gun violence. You know, car accidents. I'm gonna have to get my facts before I say this again. But this is an issue that has really flown under the radar, right? That has really not gotten a lot of public attention, and yet it touches all kinds of families, all right? In many, many ways, who cannot get services for their children. Now, that's also children dying, but not necessarily by gun. So I just think there's plenty of space to talk about things like life. What does it mean to preserve life for real? In the US, the right has hijacked that language. Like you have the feminists saying we're pro-choice, and the anti-abortion people saying we're pro-life. And in the middle of that, the term life disappears in the robustness of how we can begin to talk about it. So I think it's really interesting that you have the Black Lives Matter movement bringing the term life to the center of debate, even though it had a lot of pushback. Don't all lives matter? We heard that. Such that March for Our Lives becomes the theme of a mass march by some young people who have been, and many young people, you should just Google to see how many people showed up at that march. And that was pretty amazing to me, that they pulled that together as quickly as they did. And we have protections in the US so that can happen, right? I mean, the police will come and protect them in Washington, D.C. to protect that right of free speech. But that doesn't mean it's still not dangerous to say and do certain things. But anyhow, that's a long answer to both of your questions combined.
Boa noite a todos. Boa noite em especial para a professora. Meu nome é Inara. Boa noite, professora. Meu nome é Inara. Eu sou aluna do programa de mestrado da Faculdade de Direito da USP de Ribeirão Preto. E a minha pergunta é a seguinte: quando a senhora fala em questão de justiça social, eu associo bastante com as demandas de acesso à justiça, dos movimentos sociais, em especial do movimento de mulheres negras. Enfim, todas as possibilidades, as dificuldades que o movimento negro tem de acessar o sistema de justiça, né? E a Defensoria Pública é um meio que a gente tem aqui no Brasil de maior acesso, né, de maior facilidade de se acessar o sistema de justiça. E é o meio que os movimentos negros mais buscam para conseguir esse acesso à justiça. Então, pensando no que a senhora fala de democracia participativa e pensando nas diversas formas que o movimento tem buscado de acessar, para além de sistema legislativo ou das dificuldades do sistema judiciário,
Eu gostaria de saber as percepções da senhora, se tem uma possibilidade de uma coalizão flexível, de uma solidariedade flexível entre o sistema de justiça como um todo e os movimentos sociais, principalmente o movimento negro. Obrigada.
That's such a huge question that is almost particular to Brazil. I see many more social movements here than I see in the US. That's the first thing that stands out for me. And I also see a very different legal system in terms of public defenders. Now, the reason I would say that is because I don't know what's happening here. Maybe I'll just talk about what I know. One major problem in the US is that you can have a public defender by law. It's protected in the law, but there aren't enough people who can help you. So you have a lot of people who end up in prison because they don't have representation, even though they're entitled to it, because it's simply not funded or it's simply not encouraged. People are encouraged to get a plea deal, as opposed to really fight in the legal system. Now, the whole question of how social movements can address those particular issues, to me is a question of really looking specifically at the issues that you think need to be addressed. Right now in the US, there's a focus on bail, and how bail, and not being able to make bail, is basically locking up poor people who cannot afford to get out and wait for their own court date because they can't pay for it. So they stay in prison or they plead. And it provides income for these private prisons that I believe you talked about. The whole notion of the privatization. See, I guess what I'm trying to think through here is, I think the relationship between the private sector and the government has shifted dramatically over the last several decades. And that privatization is almost a shadow person in the room for so much of our public policy now, that we don't realize that that's what's going on. And that certainly to me would be the case with incarceration. So in whose interest is it for people to have a public defender or not have a public defender? Who benefits if you have a large percentage of people who are in prison and who are locked up? Well, a lot of people benefit, and certainly not those people. You know, I approach this as the commodification of black bodies, and how those bodies become not valuable anymore for labor, so you use them for something else. You exploit them in a different way. And this particular system we have, and all the little micro moments of how it operates, add up. So I don't know, to me the big social movements that take on the big issues in a big way are always going to be needed. The kind of march that I mentioned to kind of highlight the issue. But to me the struggles are very local. They're very grassroots, and they're very networked around what seem to be small issues that people can understand, but that really have larger national import. I don't know if I would call that the flexible solidarity that I had in mind. I think you're talking about a form of organizational politics, and how do we reconfigure the government, social movements, and corporations primarily, not little businesses, but big global corporations who are interested in profit. That's why they're there. They're not there to do social service. And how social movements have to be much more nimble around understanding those relationships. Now that does touch on race, class, gender, sexuality, obviously, in terms of who the people are and the groups are that are involved in that. But in terms of your question and a little bit that I know about public defenders, you know, that's how I think I would cut into it.
Gente, infelizmente a gente vai ter que encerrar, devido ao horário, mas eu já quero desde já convidar todas e todos para o lançamento do livro da Natália Neres. A Natália está aqui ainda ou já foi para lá? Bom, a Natália Neves vai lançar o livro A Voz e a Palavra do Movimento Negro, constituinte de 88, no Aparelho a Luzia, e nós vamos, todos nós aqui, Patricia também vai, então estão convidados a gente continuar, de repente, já que infelizmente a gente vai ter que encerrar esse diálogo no espaço outro, né? Quero chamar a Isadora aqui para falar comigo, para fazer os agradecimentos finais. De minha parte, estou muito feliz, muito honrado de receber a professora Patricia, a professora Eunice e a professora Isis aqui ao Museu Afro Brasil. Quero agradecer às equipes do Museu Afro Brasil, o Núcleo de Educação, os educadores, em especial a Maísa, que acompanhou a professora Patrícia ao longo da visita, a equipe de comunicação, a Roseli, da produção ali, que cuidou de cada detalhe para que essa conferência, para que esse evento hoje acontecesse. Quero mais uma vez agradecer a presença de todas e todos vocês e quero fazer um agradecimento pessoal pelo prazer, o privilégio de trabalhar com a Isadora na construção desse evento. Peço desculpas se essas últimas semanas fiquei por cima, mas a Isadora foi uma parceira inestimável na construção desse evento. Ela sabe a importância da realização dessa conferência aqui no museu, o quanto a gente luta bastante, muito para construir esse evento aqui. E quero deixar uma boa noite. E espero que a gente se dê parelha daqui a pouco para continuar a conversa. Tá bom? Muito obrigado.
Então, queria reforçar, né, os agradecimentos que Rafael já fez, agradecer a presença de todas e todos, agradecer mais uma vez as nossas convidadas, a professora Patricia Collins, a professora Eunice Prudente, a professora Isis Aparecida Conceição. Dizer que para a gente esse foi um momento muito importante, é um momento marcante mesmo, ao menos para a trajetória da Defensoria Pública e do Núcleo Especializado de Defesa da Diversidade e da Igualdade Racial. Quero fazer o meu agradecimento ao museu, que recebeu prontamente, né, acolheu prontamente a nossa ideia e que trabalhou ao longo desse período de construção desse evento de uma forma tão cuidadosa, né, Rafael? Muito obrigada pelo seu engajamento nesse processo. Foi uma parceria muito valiosa, né, muito generosa, como já foi dito aqui, e a gente espera poder continuar fazendo e pensando coisas em conjunto. Eu queria, só para finalizar, mencionar a vocês que esse evento não é um evento isolado, né? Ele se insere dentro de uma programação mais ampla do núcleo nesse mês de novembro. Na verdade, é o nosso quarto evento. A gente vem fazendo algumas discussões, né, nesse período. Fizemos o lançamento de uma cartilha sobre educação escolar quilombola no dia 24. Tivemos um debate sobre os 130 anos da abolição inconclusa, no dia 13. Fizemos uma audiência pública para discutir a questão das fraudes ao sistema de cotas étnico-raciais no âmbito das universidades estaduais. E fizemos também um cine-debate sobre o filme Além do Espelho, com a Ana Flausina. Então esse é o nosso quarto evento, né, dessa programação. E amanhã a gente encerra o nosso Novembro Negro, então também queria deixar o convite, né, aos presentes para que estejam conosco amanhã, lá no auditório da Defensoria Pública, Rua Boa Vista, número 200, a partir das 13h30, a gente vai ter uma cerimônia primeiro, né, uma celebração rápida dos 10 anos do núcleo, né, que está fazendo aniversário esse ano, e na sequência a gente vai ter um debate bem interessante sobre identidades, luta por representação e território. A gente vai contar com a presença da Ana Maria Gonçalves, que imagino que a maioria de vocês conheçam, escritora aclamada, autora da importante obra, né, Um Defeito de Cor. E a ideia desse debate é discutir a questão e também com a presença da professora doutora Ana Baroni, que é da FAO da USP. A ideia é a gente discutir um pouco a questão da mudança do nome da Estação Liberdade, né? Que foi algo que gerou bastante polêmica no início do ano, então, que foi rebatizada para a Estação Japão Liberdade. A gente quer pensar um pouco com vocês como é que se dá essa disputa por representação, quando se trata da população negra na cidade de São Paulo, né, e de como as representações e a ocupação dos territórios é uma dinâmica também racializada, né. Na sequência, a gente vai contar com 2 pesquisadores negros, uma pesquisadora negra e um pesquisador não negro, que vão falar um pouco também sobre as suas pesquisas nessas temáticas. Então fica aqui o convite para todas e todos estarem conosco amanhã no encerramento do nosso Novembro Negro na Defensoria. Eu queria agradecer mais uma vez a presença de todas e convidá-las para a gente tirar uma foto aqui e registrar esse momento tão importante para a gente. Professora Patricia, if you want to say a final comment, to leave a final message for us, we will appreciate it.
Actually, I have very little left to say, except to say you are the hardy survivors of this particular program. So that says to me something about you. So whatever it is that kept you here this long, thinking about these ideas should also keep you going when you leave and have to confront all of the work that we all have to do. So thank you for coming. This has been wonderful for me to visit the museum. I haven't had a chance to thank you for this beautiful museum that really lifted my soul when I came in here. And also to see an audience, a room full of people who care about the issues that I care about as well. So I wish you well. I would say parabéns to you. I would say obrigada to you. And I would also say ciao ciao.